Touchdowns and Tides. A Heartwarming Small-Town Football Romance. By Wynne Valentine. Copyright 2025 by Wynne Valentine. All rights reserved. No part of this publication may be reproduced, stored, or transmitted in any form by any means, electronic, mechanical, photocopying, recording, scanning, or otherwise without written permission from the publisher. It is illegal to copy this book, post it to a website, or distribute it by any other means without permission. This novel is entirely a work of fiction. The names, characters, and incidents portrayed in it are the work of the author's imagination. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, events or localities, is entirely coincidental. Wynne Valentine asserts the moral right to be identified as the author of this work. Designations used by companies to distinguish their products are often claimed as trademarks. All brand names and product names used in this book and on its cover are trade names, service marks, trademarks, and registered trademarks of their respective owners. The publishers and the book are not associated with any product or vendor mentioned in this book. None of the companies referenced within the book have endorsed the book. Book cover by Dana Sacco. Chapter 1: Homecoming. Quinn Matthews gripped the steering wheel tighter as she drove past the Welcome to Oceanview sign, its faded paint a testament to the years that had passed since she'd last seen it. The coastal breeze, heavy with salt and nostalgia, whipped through her open window, tugging at the wisps of hair that had escaped her usually neat ponytail. She'd forgotten how the air here smelled different, cleaner, simpler. It was a far cry from the city's bustling streets and the scent of ambition that seemed to permeate every corner of her old life. Quinn swallowed hard, pushing down the lump in her throat. This wasn't how she'd imagined coming home. As she navigated the familiar streets, memories flooded back. The ice cream shop where she'd had her first job, the park where she'd learned to ride a bike, and the high school football field where she'd cheered from the sidelines while her dad coached. It all looked smaller now, quainter than she remembered. Quinn pulled up to the Oceanview Sharks Stadium, if you could call it that. The paint was peeling, and the sign hung crooked, swaying slightly in the breeze. She parked her sleek city car next to a beat-up pickup truck, the contrast as stark as her designer blazer against the backdrop of small-town charm. Well, she muttered to herself, this is going to be interesting. As Quinn stepped out of her car, smoothing down her blazer and adjusting her ponytail, a familiar voice called out. Quinn Matthews, as I live and breathe. You're actually here. Maggie Foster, Quinn's best friend since childhood, came bounding across the parking lot. Her curly red hair bounced with each step, and her wide grin was infectious. Before Quinn could react, Maggie enveloped her in a warm hug that smelled of coffee and sea salt. Mags, Quinn said, her voice muffled against her friend's shoulder. It's good to see you too. Maggie pulled back, holding Quinn at arm's length. Let me look at you, Miss Big City. Still rocking the power suit, I see. Quinn glanced down at her outfit and shrugged. Old habits die hard, I guess. Well, you might want to rethink that wardrobe, Maggie said with a laugh. Things have changed around here since you left. We're more flip-flops and board shorts these days. Quinn raised an eyebrow. Please tell me you're joking. Only partly, Maggie said with a wink. But seriously, Q, it's good to have you back. How are you holding up? The question hit Quinn like a punch to the gut. How was she holding up? She wasn't even sure herself. The past few months had been a whirlwind of stress, heartbreak, and loss. And now here she was, back in the last place she'd ever expected to be. I'm managing, Quinn said, forcing a smile. It's weird being back, you know? Maggie nodded, her eyes full of understanding. I can only imagine. But hey, you're here now and we're all rooting for you. Especially with this whole team manager gig. Quinn's gaze drifted back to the dilapidated stadium. Yeah, about that. As if on cue, a booming voice echoed across the parking lot. Matthews? Get your butt over here. Quinn turned to see Coach Charlie Big C Caldwell striding towards them. He looked older than she remembered, his hair more salt than pepper now, but his presence was as commanding as ever. Coach, Quinn said, extending her hand. It's been a while. Big C ignored her hand and pulled her into a bear hug. None of that formal crap, kid. Your family here. Quinn stiffened for a moment before relaxing into the embrace. It felt good, familiar. Like coming home, even if home wasn't quite what she remembered. All right, Quinn said, extracting herself from the hug. What's the situation here, coach? Dad's letter wasn't exactly detailed. Big C's face grew serious. It's not good, Quinn. We're in trouble. Sponsors are pulling out, attendance is down, and the boys, well, let's just say they're not exactly motivated. Quinn felt a headache coming on. This was supposed to be a temporary gig, a favor to her late father. Now it was starting to sound like a full-blown crisis. How bad are we talking? She asked. If we don't turn things around this season, there might not be an Oceanview Sharks next year, Big C said, his voice heavy. Quinn's mind raced. This was more than she'd bargained for. She thought of her life in the city, the career she'd left behind, the plans she'd had. And now here she was, tasked with saving a failing semi-pro football team in a town she'd outgrown years ago. Okay, she said, taking a deep breath. Let's meet the team. As they walked towards the field, Quinn's mind drifted back to her life in the city. The sleek office with its floor-to-ceiling windows, the rush of closing big deals, the thrill of climbing the corporate ladder. It had been exhilarating until it wasn't. Until the long hours and cutthroat competition had left her feeling hollow and burned out. She remembered the night she'd finally broken down, sitting alone in her expensive apartment, surrounded by the trappings of success, but feeling utterly lost. That was when her father's letter had arrived, asking for her help with the team he'd loved so much. And now here she was, trading boardrooms for locker rooms, PowerPoint presentations for play strategies. It was a far cry from what she'd imagined for herself, but maybe, just maybe, it was exactly what she needed. As they approached the field, Quinn could hear the sound of laughter and the thud of footballs being tossed around. The team was gathered in small groups, some stretching, others engaged in what looked like a very relaxed version of practice. All right, boys. Big C bellowed. Gather round. Got someone I want you to meet. The players jogged over, their easy grins and relaxed postures a stark contrast to the tense, competitive atmosphere Quinn was used to in the corporate world. This here is Quinn Matthews, Big C said, clapping a hand on her shoulder. She's our new team manager, and she's here to whip us into shape. Quinn stepped forward, trying to project an air of confidence and authority. It's nice to meet you all. I'm looking forward to working with you and... Hey coach, a voice called out, cutting her off. We doing beach practice today, or what? Quinn turned to see a tall, muscular man with sandy blonde hair and a lopsided grin. He was tossing a football from hand to hand, his green eyes twinkling with amusement. Carson, Big C growled. Show some respect. This is John Matthews' daughter. The man, Carson, raised an eyebrow. No kidding? Well, welcome to the Sharks, Miss Matthews. Hope you brought your sunscreen and flip-flops. Quinn felt her hackles rise. This was exactly the kind of laid-back, unprofessional attitude she'd been dreading. Actually, she said, her voice cool, I was thinking we might focus on actual practice today. You know, the kind that happens on a football field? Carson's grin widened. Ooh, city girls got bite. This should be interesting. The other players chuckled and Quinn felt her cheeks flush. This was not going how she'd planned. All right, that's enough, Big C said, sensing the tension. Quinn, this is Drew Carson, our quarterback and assistant coach. Drew, play nice. Quinn's here to help us, and we need all the help we can get. Drew gave a mock salute. Yes, sir. Whatever the lady says. Quinn narrowed her eyes. She dealt with cocky executives and difficult clients, but something about Drew Carson's easy charm and apparent disregard for authority got under her skin in a way she wasn't used to. Right, she said, turning to address the whole team. Let's start by going over your current training schedule and game strategies. I'd like to see where we stand and what areas need improvement. The players exchanged glances, and Quinn could practically feel their resistance. Miss Matthews, one of the younger players piped up. We usually just kind of, go with the flow, you know? Coach Drew here comes up with plays on the spot and we adapt. Quinn blinked. You're joking, right? Drew stepped forward, his grin never faltering. What can I say? We're a creative bunch. Structure isn't really our strong suit. Clearly, Quinn muttered. She took a deep breath, reminding herself that she'd faced tougher challenges than this. Okay, new plan. I want to see you all in action. Let's run some drills and I'll observe. As the team spread out across the field, Quinn couldn't help but feel like she was in over her head. This wasn't just about managing a team, it was about changing an entire culture. And Drew Carson, with his laid-back attitude and infuriating smile, seemed to embody everything she was up against. She watched as Drew called out plays, his voice carrying across the field with an easy authority. Despite her annoyance, Quinn had to admit he knew what he was doing. The players responded to him, moving with a coordination that belied their earlier casual demeanor. Impressive, isn't it? Big C said, coming to stand beside her. Drew's got a natural talent for this. The boys respect him. Quinn nodded, her mind already racing with ideas. He's good, I'll give him that. But talent isn't enough. We need structure, discipline, a real strategy if we're going to turn this team around. Big C chuckled. And that's why you're here, kid. You've got your work cut out for you, but if anyone can do it, it's John Matthews' daughter. As practice continued, Quinn found herself torn between admiration for the team's raw talent and frustration at their lack of organization. She jotted down notes, already formulating plans for new training regimens and marketing strategies. By the time Big C called an end to practice, Quinn's head was spinning with everything that needed to be done. As the players headed towards the locker rooms, Drew jogged over, his t-shirt damp with sweat. So, Miss Matthews, he said, that infuriating grin still in place. What's the verdict? Are we salvageable, or should we start looking for day jobs? Quinn met his gaze, refusing to be rattled by his charm. There's potential here, Mr. Carson. But you've got a long way to go if you want to be taken seriously as a team. Drew's grin faltered for a moment, and Quinn saw a flash of something. Hurt? Anger? In his eyes before the easy smile returned. Well then, city girl, I guess we're in for an interesting season. Looking forward to seeing what you've got planned for us. Quinn watched as Drew sauntered away, his easy confidence grating on her last nerve. She turned to Big C, who was busy gathering up stray footballs. Coach, she said, trying to keep her voice level, we need to talk about the team's finances. From what I've seen, we're in serious trouble. Big C's shoulders sagged, and he let out a heavy sigh. I know, kid. It's not looking good. We've lost some big sponsors and ticket sales are down. If we don't turn things around soon, we won't have a team to worry about, Quinn finished for him. She ran a hand through her hair, dislodging a few more strands from her ponytail. Okay, let me see the books. We need to start cutting costs and looking for new revenue streams. Drew, who had been heading towards the locker room, turned back at her words. Whoa, 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 he said, jogging over. What's all this talk about finances? We don't need to worry about that stuff. We just need to win a few games, and the fans will come flocking back. Quinn stared at him, incredulous. Are you serious? Drew, winning games is important, but it's not going to magically solve our financial problems. We need a real strategy here. Drew waved a hand dismissively. Come on, city girl. You're overthinking this. Oceanview loves its football. We start winning, and everything else will fall into place. Quinn felt her frustration rising. How could he be so nonchalant about this? It's not that simple, she argued. We need community involvement, marketing strategies, fundraising events. Winning alone isn't going to cut it. Drew's easy smile faltered for a moment, a flash of irritation crossing his face. Look, I've been here a lot longer than you have. I know this town, and I know this team. What we need is to focus on the game, not get bogged down in paperwork and fancy marketing schemes. Quinn clenched her fists, fighting the urge to shake some sense into him. And I've been managing budgets and running marketing campaigns for years. Trust me, we need both. The tension between them was palpable, the air crackling with their conflicting viewpoints. Quinn could feel Big C's eyes darting between them, clearly uncomfortable with the brewing argument. All right, Big C interjected, holding up his hands. Let's take a step back here. Quinn, why don't you take some time to look over our finances and come up with some ideas? Drew, you focus on getting the team ready for our next game. We'll regroup in a few days and figure out a plan together. Quinn nodded stiffly while Drew just shrugged, that infuriating grin back on his face. Whatever you say, coach. I'll be on the field if anyone needs me. You know, actually playing football. As Drew jogged away, Quinn felt a wave of doubt wash over her. What had she gotten herself into? This was supposed to be a temporary gig, a favor to her late father. Now she was butting heads with a cocky ex-pro player and trying to save a failing team that didn't seem to want her help. Don't let him get to you, Big C said softly, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. Drew's a good guy, and a hell of a player. He's been through a lot. Football's all he's got left. Quinn sighed, feeling some of her anger deflate. I get it, coach. But if we don't address these issues, there won't be any football left for any of us. Big C nodded, his expression somber. I know, kid. I know. As Quinn gathered her things, feeling more overwhelmed than ever, she heard a familiar voice calling her name. Quinn. Hey, wait up. She turned to see Maggie jogging towards her, a bright smile on her face despite the humid air that was making her red curls frizz. Mags, Quinn said, managing a small smile. What are you doing here? Maggie grinned, slightly out of breath. I own the best coffee shop in town, remember? I'm always where the action is. Plus, I may have overheard your little discussion with Drew. Quinn groaned. Great. I'm sure the whole town will know about it by dinner time. Maggie laughed, linking her arm through Quinn's. Oh, honey. This is Oceanview. The whole town already knows. But that's not why I'm here. I've got an idea that might help. Quinn raised an eyebrow, intrigued despite her frustration. I'm listening. Well, Maggie said, her eyes sparkling with excitement, what if we organized a big event to get the town back behind the team? Something that would remind everyone why they loved the Sharks in the first place? Quinn felt a spark of hope ignite in her chest. That could actually work. But what kind of event? Maggie's grin widened. I was thinking something community-driven. Maybe a charity game? Or a meet and greet with the players? Oh. And my cafe could cater it. Nothing brings people together like good coffee and pastries. As Maggie spoke, ideas began to form in Quinn's mind. She could see it now, a big community event showcasing the team's talents while also giving back to the town. It could generate positive press, attract potential sponsors, and maybe even boost ticket sales. Maggie, you're a genius, Quinn said, feeling truly excited for the first time since she'd arrived in Oceanview. This is exactly what we need. Something that shows the town we're more than just a football team, we're part of the community. Maggie beamed, clearly pleased with herself. See? This is why we make such a great team. You've got the business smarts, and I've got the local know-how. Quinn's mind was already racing with possibilities. We could partner with a local charity, she mused. Maybe the animal shelter? I remember how much this town loves its pets. Oh, that's perfect, Maggie exclaimed. We could do a touchdowns for tails event or something. Have the players volunteer at the shelter, maybe even bring some adoptable pets to the game. Quinn nodded enthusiastically, her earlier frustration with Drew momentarily forgotten. We could set up booths for local businesses, have a silent auction. This could be huge, Mags. As they walked towards the parking lot, Quinn and Maggie continued to bounce ideas off each other. For the first time since she'd arrived in Oceanview, Quinn felt like she was on solid ground. This was what she was good at, taking a problem and finding creative solutions. You know, Maggie said as they reached Quinn's car, I think this is exactly what your dad had in mind when he asked you to come back. He always said you had a knack for bringing people together. Quinn felt a lump form in her throat at the mention of her father. "I hope you're right," she said softly. "I just want to do right by him, you know." Maggie squeezed her arm gently. "You will, Q, I know it." As Quinn climbed into her car, she felt a renewed sense of determination. She might be out of her element in this small coastal town, but she wasn't going to let that stop her. She'd save this team, even if it meant clashing with Drew Carson again. Speaking of Drew, Quinn spotted him across the parking lot, laughing with a couple of his teammates. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and Quinn felt that same spark of irritation and something else she couldn't quite name. She shook her head, pushing thoughts of the frustrating quarterback out of her mind. She had work to do. As Quinn drove away from the stadium, her mind was already buzzing with plans for the community event. She'd need to reach out to local businesses, coordinate with the animal shelter, and figure out a marketing strategy that would reach beyond just the die-hard football fans. And then there was the team itself. How was she going to get Drew and the other players on board with this idea? She could already imagine Drew's dismissive attitude, his insistence that they should focus solely on the game. Quinn gripped the steering wheel tighter, her jaw set in determination. She'd make him see reason, even if it meant going head-to-head with him at every turn. This wasn't just about winning games anymore. It was about saving a team that meant so much to her father and to this town. As she navigated the familiar streets of Oceanview, Quinn couldn't help but notice how much had changed since she'd left. The old movie theater had been turned into a trendy gastropub, and there was a new yoga studio where the hardware store used to be. It was still Oceanview, but it felt different. Or maybe she was the one who had changed. Quinn pulled up to the small house she'd inherited from her father. It felt strange to be back here, surrounded by memories of a life she'd left behind. She sat in the car for a moment, taking in the peeling paint on the porch and the overgrown flower beds that her mother had once tended so lovingly. With a deep breath, Quinn got out of the car and headed inside. She had work to do. Over the next few hours, Quinn threw herself into planning mode. She spread papers across the dining room table, scribbling ideas and making lists. She reached out to old contacts, called the local animal shelter, and started drafting a proposal for potential sponsors. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the room, Quinn leaned back in her chair and rubbed her eyes. She'd forgotten how exhilarating it could be to work on something she truly cared about. In the city, her work had become a blur of meetings and deadlines, each project blending into the next. But this felt different. Personal. Her phone buzzed, and she glanced down to see a text from Maggie. "How's the planning going, boss lady? Don't forget to eat something." Quinn smiled, realizing she'd been so caught up in her work that she'd completely forgotten about dinner. She was about to reply when another text came through, this time from an unknown number. "Heard you're planning some big event. Hope you're not forgetting about actual football practice. Drew?" Quinn felt her earlier irritation flare up again. How had he even gotten her number? And more importantly, why did he always have to be so dismissive of her ideas? She typed out a quick reply. "Don't worry, Carson. I can multitask. See you at practice tomorrow." As she hit send, Quinn couldn't help but feel a mix of annoyance and excitement. There was something about sparring with Drew that got her blood pumping in a way she hadn't felt in a long time. Shaking her head, Quinn pushed thoughts of the infuriating quarterback aside and focused on the task at hand. She had a team to save and a community to win over. And she was determined to succeed, no matter what obstacles or charming, stubborn ex-football players stood in her way. Chapter 2: Game Plan. The next morning, Quinn arrived at the stadium early, her arms laden with folders and her laptop bag slung over her shoulder. She'd spent half the night perfecting her presentation, determined to win over the team, and especially Drew, with her charity event idea. Despite her confidence in the plan, a lingering irritation from her text exchange with Drew the night before still prickled at the back of her mind. She sat up in the team's meeting room, arranging her materials on the long table and connecting her laptop to the projector. As she worked, She couldn't help but glance at the clock every few minutes, her stomach tightening with a mix of anticipation and nerves. Just as she finished her setup, the door swung open. Drew sauntered in, his hair slightly damp from what she assumed was an early morning workout. He raised an eyebrow at her elaborate display. "Wow, Matthews. You going all corporate on us?" he asked, a hint of amusement in his voice. Quinn straightened, meeting his gaze with a cool smile. "Some of us like to be prepared, Carson. You might want to try it sometime." Drew chuckled, dropping into a chair at the far end of the table. "I'll stick to what I know, thanks. You know, actual football." Before Quinn could retort, the rest of the team began filing in, filling the room with a buzz of conversation and the scrape of chairs against the floor. Coach Big C entered last, giving Quinn a nod of encouragement as he took his seat. Quinn took a deep breath, steeling herself. This was it. She clicked to her first slide and cleared her throat. "Good morning, everyone. As you know, the Sharks have been facing some challenges lately." She paused, noting the grimaces and nods around the room. "But I believe I have a solution that will not only help our financial situation, but also boost team morale and community support." She clicked to the next slide, revealing a mock-up poster for the event. "I propose we host a charity beach football game. We'll partner with the local animal shelter, raising money for both the team and a good cause. It's a win-win situation that will get the whole town involved and excited about the Sharks again." Quinn continued her pitch, detailing the logistics and potential benefits. She was just getting to the part about increased ticket sales when Drew's voice cut through her explanation. "Hold up," he said, leaning forward with his elbows on the table. "You want us to waste valuable practice time playing fetch on the beach? We're a football team, not a bunch of lifeguards." Quinn felt her cheeks flush with irritation. "It's not playing fetch, Drew. It's community engagement. Something this team desperately needs if we want to keep our fans and attract sponsors." Drew scoffed. "What we need is to win games. And we do that by practicing, not by posing for photo ops with puppies." "It's not just about photo ops," Quinn argued, her voice rising slightly. "It's about connecting with our community, showing them that we're more than just a team that loses games." "Ouch," one of the players muttered, but Quinn pressed on. "Football isn't just about what happens on the field. It's about the fans, the town, the entire ecosystem that supports the team. We can't ignore that." Drew stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Football is about hard work, dedication, and skill. It's about pushing yourself to be better, to play better. Not about prancing around on the beach for likes on Instagram." Quinn felt her patience snapping. "And how's that working out for you so far? Because from where I'm standing, all that hard work isn't translating into wins or ticket sales." The room fell silent, the tension palpable. Quinn immediately regretted her words, knowing she'd crossed a line. Drew's jaw clenched, his eyes flashing with anger and something else. "Hurt maybe?" "At least we're out there trying," he said, his voice low and intense. "Not hiding behind spreadsheets and marketing gimmicks." Coach Big C cleared his throat loudly. All right. Let's all take a breath here." Quinn and Drew continued to glare at each other, neither willing to back down. Around the room, players exchanged glances, a few of them discreetly passing money under the table as bets were settled. "Quinn," Big C continued, "I appreciate the effort you've put into this. It's a solid idea, and I think it could do us some good." But he held up a hand as Quinn started to smile triumphantly. "Drew has a point too. We can't lose sight of our primary goal, which is to improve our game." He looked between Quinn and Drew, his expression stern. "I suggest we find a middle ground. We'll do the charity event, but we'll schedule it so it doesn't interfere with our regular practice times. And we'll use it as an opportunity for some unconventional training. Beach football can be great for agility and endurance." Quinn nodded, relieved that her idea hadn't been completely shot down. Drew, however, still looked skeptical. "Fine," Drew said, crossing his arms. "But I want it on record that I think this is a waste of time." "Noted," Big C said dryly. "Now, why don't we hear the rest of Quinn's proposal? and then we can discuss how to integrate it with our training schedule." As Quinn resumed her presentation, she couldn't help but feel Drew's eyes on her. The intensity of his gaze made her skin prickle, and she found herself stumbling over her words more than once. She silently cursed herself for letting him get under her skin like this. When she finally finished, the room erupted into a mix of questions and suggestions. Most of the team seemed cautiously optimistic about the idea, even excited about the prospect of a day at the beach. But Drew remained silent, his expression unreadable. As the meeting wrapped up and people started to file out, Quinn began gathering her materials. She was so focused on not looking at Drew that she didn't notice him approach until he was right beside her. "Look," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "I still think this is a bad idea. But I'll do my part. For the team." Quinn watched Drew's retreating back as he left the meeting room, her emotions a mix of frustration and determination. She'd won the battle, but the war was far from over. With a sigh, she finished packing up her materials, her mind already racing with plans for the charity event. Over the next few days, Quinn threw herself into organizing the beach football game. She created a detailed spreadsheet, mapping out every aspect of the event from sponsorships to logistics. As she worked, she couldn't help but feel a twinge of satisfaction imagining Drew's face when the event turned out to be a massive success. On a sunny Tuesday morning, Quinn pushed open the door to Seaside Sips Cafe, the familiar chime of the bell above the door bringing a smile to her face. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee and warm pastries enveloped her as she stepped inside. Maggie looked up from behind the counter, her face lighting up at the sight of her friend. "Quinn. Just the person I wanted to see. How'd the big presentation go?" Quinn slid onto a stool at the counter, dropping her bag beside her. "It went well mostly. The team's on board, but Drew's being his usual charming self about it." Maggie snorted, sliding a steaming latte across the counter to Quinn without being asked. "That man could argue with the stop sign. Don't let him get to you." "Easier said than done," Quinn muttered, taking a sip of her coffee. The rich, smooth flavor helped ease some of the tension from her shoulders. "Actually, that's part of why I'm here. I was hoping Seaside Sips might be interested in sponsoring the event." Maggie's eyes sparkled with interest. "Oh? Tell me more." Quinn launched into her pitch, detailing the plans for the charity game and the benefits of sponsorship. As she spoke, she couldn't help but notice a gleam in Maggie's eye that went beyond simple interest in the event. "This is perfect timing actually," Maggie said when Quinn finished. "I've been thinking about expanding the cafe. Maybe opening a small kiosk down by the beach. This event could be a great way to test the waters, so to speak." Quinn's eyebrows shot up. "Expanding? Mags, that's fantastic. Why didn't you tell me?" Maggie shrugged, a mischievous smile playing on her lips. "It's still in the early stages. But who knows? If your event is a hit, it might just push me to take the plunge." They spent the next hour hashing out the details of Seaside Sips' involvement in the event. By the time Quinn left, clutching a to-go cup of coffee and a bag of Maggie's famous blueberry muffins, she felt a renewed sense of excitement about the whole endeavor. Her next stop was Salty Waves Surf Company, just a short walk down the boardwalk. The shop's exterior was as vibrant as its owner, painted in shades of blue and adorned with surfboards and beach-themed decorations. As Quinn pushed open the door, a wave of cool air hit her, a welcome respite from the growing heat outside. The shop was quiet, with only the soft strumming of a ukulele playing over the speakers. "Lila?" Quinn called out, making her way past racks of colorful swimsuits and beach gear. "Back here." Lila's voice rang out from the rear of the store. Quinn found her perched on a stool behind the counter, a pile of wetsuits in front of her. Lila's face broke into a wide grin when she saw Quinn. "Well, if it isn't the mastermind behind the beach bonanza I keep hearing about," Lila said, hopping off her stool. "Drew's been grumbling about it non-stop. Which means it must be a great idea." Quinn laughed, feeling a mix of pride and exasperation at the mention of Drew's complaints. "I'm glad someone thinks so. Actually, I was hoping Salty Waves might want to get involved. We could use some help with the logistics, maybe some equipment." Lila's eyes lit up. "Are you kidding? I'm all over this. We could set up a little demo area, maybe do some quick surf lessons between games. Oh, and I've got these awesome new beach volleyball sets that would be perfect." As Lila rattled off ideas, her enthusiasm infectious, Quinn found herself relaxing. This was exactly the kind of support she needed. "So," Lila said, leaning on the counter with a mischievous glint in her eye, "while we're on the subject of my brother." Quinn felt her cheeks warm. "We weren't on that subject, actually." Lila waved her hand dismissively. Details. The point is, I couldn't help but notice the, shall we say, tension between you two. And not just the angry kind." "Lila," Quinn warned, but the other woman pressed on. "All I'm saying is, maybe you need a little help in the love department. I happen to be an expert, you know." Quinn raised an eyebrow. "An expert? Is that why I saw you sneaking out of the crab shack at 6 a.m. last Saturday, still wearing your clothes from Friday night?" Lila gasped in mock offense. "I'll have you know that was a very successful date. So successful it lasted until morning." Despite herself, Quinn laughed. "I think I'll pass on the love advice for now, thanks. Let's focus on the event, shall we?" They spent the next hour going over the details, with Lila offering up a wealth of ideas and resources. By the time Quinn left the shop, she had a pages-long list of notes, and a feeling of growing excitement about the event. Over the next few days, Quinn threw herself into securing additional sponsorships and organizing the logistics of the charity game. She visited the local pet store, convincing them to sponsor a halftime dog show. The town's favorite food truck agreed to set up shop at the event, promising to donate a portion of their proceeds to the cause. Each small victory felt like a step closer to proving Drew wrong, to showing him and the entire town that she knew what she was doing. But with each passing day, she also felt the pressure mounting. The event had to be perfect. There was no room for failure. As she finalized the last details, triple-checking her meticulously organized spreadsheets, Quinn allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. She'd done it. Everything was in place, ready to go. Now all that was left was to execute the plan and show everyone, especially Drew, just how successful this waste of time could be. Chapter 3: Beach Party. The morning of the charity event dawned bright and clear, with a gentle breeze carrying the scent of salt and sunscreen across the beach. Quinn stood at the edge of the makeshift field, clipboard in hand, her stomach a knot of nerves and excitement. She'd been up since dawn, double-checking every detail, from the placement of the vendor booths to the setup of the temporary bleachers. As she watched the first families start to trickle onto the beach, Quinn took a deep breath, willing her racing heart to slow. This was it. The moment of truth. "Looking a little green there, Matthews," a familiar voice drawled behind her. "You're not going to puke on the field, are you? Because I don't think that's the kind of publicity we're looking for." Quinn turned to find Drew standing there, his arms crossed over his chest and a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. Despite the teasing tone, she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes darted around, taking in every detail of the setup. "Your concern is touching, Carson," Quinn replied dryly. "But I assure you, I'm fine. Everything is under control." Drew raised an eyebrow. "If you say so. Just remember, we've still got a game to play here. This isn't just about face painting and cotton candy." Before Quinn could retort, a chorus of excited barks caught their attention. They turned to see a group of volunteers from the local animal shelter arriving, each leading a dog decked out in a tiny Sharks jersey. "Oh my God, that's adorable," Quinn couldn't help but exclaim, her face breaking into a genuine smile. Even Drew's expression softened a bit. "Okay, I'll give you that one. That's pretty cute." As the morning progressed, the beach began to fill with people. Families spread out blankets on the sand, kids ran around with foam shark fins strapped to their backs, and the smell of grilled hot dogs and fresh popcorn filled the air. The vendors Quinn had recruited were doing brisk business, with lines forming at the food trucks and the face-painting booth. Quinn moved through the crowd, clipboard still clutched to her chest like a lifeline, making sure everything was running smoothly. She paused to chat with some of the shelter volunteers, who reported that several of the dogs had already caught the eye of potential adopters. Quinn. Maggie's voice cut through the crowd noise. Quinn turned to see her friend waving from her cafe's booth, where she was handing out samples of her famous blueberry muffins. This is amazing. I've already had 3 people ask about catering. Quinn felt a wave of relief wash over her. Maybe this crazy idea was actually going to work. As the time for the game approached, Quinn made her way over to where Drew was gathering the team. She couldn't help but notice the way his t-shirt clung to his broad shoulders, or how the sun brought out the golden highlights in his hair. She quickly shook off those thoughts. Now was not the time to get distracted by Drew Carson's annoyingly attractive everything. "How's it looking, coach?" she asked, trying to keep her tone professional. Drew surveyed the growing crowd, a hint of surprise in his eyes. "Better than expected, I'll give you that. But let's see how they react to the actual game, shall we?" As Drew began to brief the players, Quinn noticed a group of younger guys hanging back, looking a bit uncertain. She recognized Ethan Cole, the Sharks' star quarterback, among them. "Hey Ethan," she called out. "Who are your friends?" Ethan jogged over, a proud smile on his face. "These are some of the kids from the high school team I've been working with. I thought it might be good for them to see how we do things, maybe help out a bit." Quinn felt a surge of warmth. This was exactly the kind of community involvement she'd been hoping for. "That's a great idea, Ethan. Why don't you guys help set up the water stations? And make sure you stick around for the second half. We might need some enthusiastic volunteers for the halftime show." As Ethan led his group of eager helpers away, Quinn caught Drew watching the interaction, an unreadable expression on his face. The first half of the game kicked off to enthusiastic cheers from the crowd. Quinn was relieved to see that people seemed genuinely engaged, laughing at the players' antics as they adjusted to playing on sand instead of turf. She found herself getting caught up in the excitement, cheering along with the crowd as Ethan made a particularly impressive pass. When she glanced over at Drew, she was surprised to see him looking back at her, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. For a moment their eyes met, and Quinn felt a flutter in her stomach that had nothing to do with nerves about the event. The moment was broken when Drew suddenly frowned, his gaze shifting past her to the water's edge. He jogged over, gesturing for her to follow. "Quinn," he said, his voice low and serious, "we might have a problem." She followed his gaze, her heart sinking as she realized what he was looking at. The tide was coming in, and it was coming in fast. "The tide charts must have been off," Drew continued. "If it keeps rising at this rate, we're going to lose half the field before the game's over." Quinn felt a flash of panic. How could she have overlooked something so basic? She checked and double-checked every other aspect of the event, but somehow the tide had slipped her mind entirely. "It'll be fine," she said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "We've still got plenty of beach. We can just move everything back a bit if we need to." Drew looked skeptical. "You sure about that? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like Mother Nature might have other plans for your perfect day." Quinn bristled at his tone. "It's not just my day, Drew. This is for the team, remember? For the town. We'll figure it out." As they argued in hushed tones, neither of them noticed Ethan approaching until he cleared his throat. Guys? Is everything okay?" he asked, looking between them with concern. Drew ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident in every line of his body. "We might have a slight issue with the tide, but it's nothing to worry about. Right, Quinn?" Quinn nodded, perhaps a bit too enthusiastically. "Absolutely. Everything's under control. Why don't you go ahead and start organizing the players for the halftime show?" Ethan nodded, though he still looked uncertain as he jogged back to the team. As the final minutes of the first half ticked down, Quinn couldn't help but notice more and more people in the crowd glancing nervously at the encroaching water. The excitement that had been building all morning seemed to be ebbing along with the retreating sand. The whistle blew for halftime, and Quinn felt a moment of relief. At least they'd made it this far without disaster striking. But as she watched the water creep ever closer to their carefully constructed field, she couldn't shake the feeling that the real challenge was just beginning. Drew appeared at her side, his earlier smirk replaced by a look of genuine concern. "So what's the plan, Matthews? Because unless you've got King Canute on speed dial, we're going to need to do something fast." Quinn took a deep breath, her mind racing. She'd faced challenges in her corporate job before, but nothing quite like this. Still, she wasn't about to let a little water wash away everything she'd worked for. "Okay," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Here's what we're going to do." As Quinn began to outline her hastily formulated plan, she couldn't help but notice the way Drew was looking at her. There was something in his eyes, respect maybe? Or was it something else? Whatever it was, she didn't have time to dwell on it now. They had a charity event to save, and come hell or high water, quite literally, Quinn Matthews was determined to make it happen. Quinn took a deep breath, her mind racing as she formulated a plan. "Okay," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "We're going to move the field back. Ethan and his high school volunteers can help us shift the boundary markers and the temporary goalposts. We'll make it a game, who can move their section the fastest." Drew nodded, a hint of admiration in his eyes. "Not bad, Matthews. I'll get the team to help out too. We can turn it into a warm-up drill." As they set their plan into motion, the crowd began to buzz with curiosity. Quinn grabbed the microphone, her heart pounding. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a special surprise for you. We're going to give you a behind-the-scenes look at how quickly our sharks can adapt to changing conditions. Let's see how fast they can move this field." To Quinn's relief, the crowd cheered, clearly amused by the unexpected turn of events. She watched as Drew organized the players and volunteers, his commanding presence evident as he directed the controlled chaos. Just as they finished repositioning the field, Maggie rushed up to Quinn, slightly out of breath. "The dog show is ready to start," she said. "But are you sure this is a good idea, with everything else going on?" Quinn hesitated for a moment, then nodded firmly. "We're going ahead as planned. The crowd needs something to keep them entertained while the players catch their breath." As the dog show began, Quinn felt a flutter of hope. The crowd seemed to be enjoying the antics of the sheltered dogs, each one strutting their stuff in their tiny Sharks jerseys. But her relief was short-lived. Suddenly, a small terrier broke free from its handler, darting across the newly positioned field with its leash trailing behind. The crowd erupted in laughter as the dog zigzagged between players' legs, clearly thrilled with its newfound freedom. "Oh no," Quinn muttered, watching in horror as two more dogs followed suit, inspired by their escapee friend. Drew jogged over to her, an amused smirk playing on his lips. "Well, Matthews, looks like your perfect plan just went to the dogs." Quinn shot him a glare, but there was no real heat behind it. She was too focused on the unfolding chaos to properly appreciate his pun. "Very funny, Carson. Are you going to help or just stand there making jokes?" Drew's smirk widened into a grin. "Oh, I wouldn't miss this for the world. Besides, I think my team's got it covered." Quinn followed his gaze to see the Sharks players attempting to corral the runaway dogs. Ethan Cole was on his hands and knees, trying to coax a particularly stubborn pug out from under a bench, while Tank Jackson, the team's burly linebacker, was being led in circles by a surprisingly speedy Chihuahua. The crowd was eating it up, their laughter and cheers growing louder with each failed attempt to catch the dogs. Quinn couldn't help but notice that even some of the more serious-looking attendees were now grinning and pointing at the field. "Come on," Drew said, nudging her shoulder. "Let's go give them a hand before this turns into a full-on dog park." Together, they made their way onto the field. Quinn found herself chasing after a golden retriever, who seemed to think this was all a wonderful game of keep away. She could hear Drew laughing behind her as she lunged for the dog's leash, missing it by inches. "Having trouble there, Matthews?" he called out, his voice filled with amusement. Quinn straightened up, blowing a stray strand of hair out of her face. "I'd like to see you do better, Carson," she shot back. As if on cue, the golden retriever changed direction, heading straight for Drew. He crouched down, arms outstretched, ready to catch the dog. But at the last second, the retriever veered off, leaving Drew grabbing at thin air and losing his balance. He toppled over onto the sand, and Quinn couldn't hold back her laughter. "Oh yeah, you're a real pro at this," she teased, offering him a hand up. Drew took it, a rueful grin on his face. "All right, you got me. I guess neither of us is cut out for dog wrangling." As they stood there, hands still clasped, Quinn became acutely aware of how close they were standing. She could see the flecks of gold in Drew's green eyes, feel the warmth of his hand in hers. For a moment, the chaos around them seemed to fade away. The spell was broken by a chorus of excited barks. They turned to see that Ethan and his high school volunteers had managed to round up most of the escaped dogs. The pug that had been hiding under the bench was now happily nestled in Ethan's arms, looking very pleased with itself. "Well, would you look at that?" Drew said, his voice softer than Quinn had ever heard it. "Looks like the kid saved the day." Quinn nodded, feeling a swell of pride. This wasn't at all how she had planned the halftime show, but somehow, it felt even better than what she had envisioned. The crowd was still laughing and cheering, clearly entertained by the unexpected turn of events. As the last of the dogs was corralled and the players began to take their positions for the second half, Quinn caught Maggie's eye in the crowd. Her friend gave her a thumbs up and a wink, mouthing, "That was amazing." Quinn felt a weight lift off her shoulders. Maybe Drew had been right. Sometimes the best moments were the unscripted ones. The second half of the game kicked off with renewed energy. The crowd, still buzzing from the halftime excitement, cheered enthusiastically for every play. Quinn found herself getting caught up in the game, shouting encouragement to the players and high-fiving nearby fans when the Sharks scored. As the final minutes ticked down, Quinn realized that despite all the chaos, or perhaps because of it, the event had been a success. The stands were still full, the vendors were doing brisk business, and she had overheard several people talking about coming to future Sharks games. The final whistle blew, and the crowd erupted in cheers. Quinn watched as Drew gathered the team for a post-game huddle, his face lit up with a genuine smile. She felt a flutter in her stomach that had nothing to do with nerves or the stress of the day. As the crowd began to disperse and the cleanup efforts started, Drew made his way over to where Quinn was standing. "Well, Matthews," he said, running a hand through his hair, "I've got to hand it to you. This was not a complete disaster." Quinn raised an eyebrow. "Wow, such high praise. I'm overwhelmed." Drew chuckled, shaking his head. All right. It was actually pretty great. The team's buzzing, the crowd loved it, and I think I saw at least 3 of those shelter dogs getting adopted on the spot." "Really?" Quinn felt a surge of joy at that news. "Really?" Drew confirmed. "You did good, Quinn. This town needed something like this, and you pulled it off." The use of her first name didn't escape Quinn's notice. It felt different, more personal, coming from Drew. "Thanks," she said softly. "I couldn't have done it without your help, though. You and the team really came through when things got crazy." They stood there for a moment, the sounds of the dispersing crowd and the crashing waves filling the silence between them. Quinn found herself studying Drew's face, noticing the way the setting sun brought out the gold in his hair and softened the lines around his eyes. Drew cleared his throat, breaking the moment. "So, I guess we make a pretty good team after all, huh?" Quinn nodded, feeling a smile tug at her lips. "I guess we do." For a brief moment, Quinn thought she saw something flicker in Drew's eyes, a warmth and intensity that made her breath catch. But before she could process it, he took a step back, his coach persona sliding back into place. "Well, I should go help with the cleanup," he said, gesturing vaguely towards the field. "Good job today, Matthews. Maybe you're not so bad at this small-town stuff after all." As Drew walked away, Quinn couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between them. The tension was still there, but it felt different now, charged with something she wasn't quite ready to name. Shaking her head to clear her thoughts, Quinn turned her attention back to the beach. There was still work to be done, and she was determined to see this through to the end. But as she began to help with the cleanup, she couldn't help but steal glances at Drew, wondering what the future might hold for them and for the Oceanview Sharks. Chapter 4, Huddle Up. As the sun dipped lower on the horizon, casting a golden glow over the beach, the post-game festivities continued in full swing. Families lingered, children chased each other across the sand, and the air buzzed with excited chatter. Quinn Matthews moved through the crowd, her chest swelling with pride as she overheard snippets of conversation praising the event. "Did you see that halftime show? I haven't laughed that hard in years," an elderly gentleman chuckled to his wife. "Mom, can we come to the next game? Please," a young boy tugged at his mother's sleeve, eyes wide with excitement. Quinn couldn't help but smile. This was exactly what she'd hoped for. A renewed interest in the Sharks, a sense of community spirit, and most importantly, a successful fundraiser for both the team and the animal shelter. As she approached the refreshment table, she caught sight of Maggie, who was busy restocking napkins and cups. "Quinn," Maggie called out, waving her over. "This is amazing. I've already had 3 people ask about season tickets for the Sharks. Can you believe it?" Quinn beamed, helping herself to a cup of lemonade. "That's fantastic. I knew we could do it. Did you see how many people showed up?" Maggie nodded enthusiastically. "And I heard the animal shelters already got a bunch of adoption applications. You really knocked it out of the park, or should I say, kicked it through the goalposts?" They both laughed, and Quinn felt a warm glow of satisfaction. This was why she'd come back to Oceanview, to make a difference, to bring people together. She'd done that today, and it felt incredible. As Maggie excused herself to tend to a spill near the popcorn machine, Quinn's gaze drifted across the beach. That's when she spotted Drew Carson, standing at the edge of the crowd, his brow furrowed as he surveyed the scene. Even from a distance, she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw clenched and unclenched. Steeling herself, Quinn decided to approach him. They'd worked together to pull this off, after all. Surely he could see the positive impact it was having on the town and the team. "Hey coach," she said, coming to stand beside him. "Quite a turnout, huh?" Drew turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "Yeah, it's something all right." Quinn frowned, detecting a note of displeasure in his voice. "Is everything okay? I thought the game went well, all things considered." Drew let out a short, humorless laugh. "All things considered? You mean the dogs running onto the field, the rising tide nearly washing away our end zone, and half the team more focused on showing off for the crowd than actually playing?" Quinn felt her earlier elation start to deflate. "Come on, Drew. It wasn't that bad. The crowd loved it, and we raised a ton of money for both the team and the shelter." "Sure, the crowd loved it," Drew conceded, his voice low and intense. "But at what cost? This isn't what football is about, Quinn. It's not a circus act or a publicity stunt. It's about discipline, strategy, and teamwork." Quinn felt her temper flare. "And what good is all that discipline and strategy if there's no one in the stands to watch it? The town needed this, Drew. They needed to remember why they loved the Sharks in the first place." Drew shook his head, frustration evident in every line of his body. "What they need is a winning team, not a sideshow. Do you think anyone's going to take us seriously after today? We looked like amateurs out there." "We look like a team that cares about its community," Quinn fired back, her voice rising slightly. "A team that's willing to have a little fun and give back to the town that supports them. What's wrong with that?" Drew ran a hand through his hair, his green eyes flashing with irritation. "What's wrong is that it takes focus away from what really matters, winning games. You can throw all the beach parties you want, Quinn, but if we don't start winning, none of it will matter. The stands will be empty again before you know it." Quinn felt her face flush with anger. "You're missing the point entirely, Drew. This isn't just about winning games. It's about building a connection with the town, creating a sense of belonging. Today wasn't just about football, it was about bringing people together. And how long do you think that warm, fuzzy feeling is going to last if we keep losing?" Drew challenged, taking a step closer to her. "Football isn't just about community spirit, Quinn. It's a competitive sport. We need to be focused on improving our game, not planning the next beach barbecue." Quinn stood her ground, refusing to be intimidated by Drew's proximity. And how exactly do you plan on improving your game if you can't even fill the stands? You need supporters, Drew. You need people who believe in this team, who are invested in its success. That's what today was about. They glared at each other, the tension between them palpable. Quinn could feel her heart racing, a mix of frustration and something else she couldn't quite name. Drew's eyes were locked on hers, his jaw set in a stubborn line. You don't get it, do you? Drew said, his voice low and intense. This isn't some corporate team-building exercise. These guys put their bodies on the line every time they step onto that field. They need to be focused, disciplined, ready for anything. Today's little spectacle? It undermines all of that. Quinn felt her patience snap. And you don't get that without community support. There won't be a team to coach. Wake up, Drew. The Sharks were struggling before I got here. You need more than just practice and discipline. You need a fan base, sponsors, people who care about more than just the score at the end of the game. Drew opened his mouth to retort, but Quinn cut him off. No, you listen to me. I saw families out there today who probably haven't been to a game in years. I saw kids begging their parents to bring them to the next match. I saw local businesses eager to support the team. That's what's going to keep this team alive, Drew. Not your outdated, hard-nosed approach to coaching. For a moment, Drew looked like he'd been slapped. Then his expression hardened. Outdated? You think winning is outdated? You think dedication and hard work are outdated? Maybe in your world of marketing spin and PR stunts, but out here in the real world, that's what counts. Quinn felt her hands ball into fists at her sides. The real world? Are you kidding me? I've worked with professional teams, Drew. I know what it takes to build a successful franchise. And let me tell you, it's not just about what happens on the field. It's about creating a brand, a story that people want to be part of. A brand? Drew scoffed. Is that all this is to you? Just another product to sell? Of course not. Quinn exclaimed, exasperated. It's about creating something meaningful, something that brings people together. Why can't you see that? They stood there, glaring at each other, neither willing to back down. The sounds of the beach party faded into the background, drowned out by the tension crackling between them. Finally, Drew spoke, his voice low and controlled. I see a team that needs to focus on winning games, not throwing parties. I see players who need guidance and discipline, not distractions. And I see a town manager who's in over her head, trying to apply big city ideas to a small town team. Quinn felt like she'd been punched in the gut. She took a step back, her voice cold when she finally found it. And I see a coach who's so stuck in his ways, he can't see a good thing when it's right in front of him. Good luck winning games with empty stands, Drew. I'm sure that'll do wonders for team morale. As Quinn and Drew stood locked in their heated exchange, a group of excited kids approached, their eyes wide with admiration. Coach Carson. Coach Carson, a freckle-faced boy called out, waving a football and a marker. Can we get your autograph? The tension between Quinn and Drew shattered like glass. Drew's demeanor shifted instantly, his face softening as he turned to the children. Of course, guys. Come on over. Quinn watched, still seething, as Drew knelt down to sign autographs and chat with the kids. His easy smile and gentle manner with them only frustrated her more. How could someone be so warm one moment and so infuriatingly stubborn the next? She turned away, not wanting to watch Drew play the role of local hero. As she did, she nearly collided with Maggie, who had materialized beside her with a knowing grin. "Oh there, Tiger," Maggie said, steadying Quinn with the hand on her arm. I could feel the heat from that argument all the way over by the lemonade stand. You two really know how to light up a beach, don't you? Quinn rolled her eyes, trying to shake off her irritation. It's not like that, Mags. He's just so handsome, charming, irresistible, Maggie supplied, her eyes twinkling with mischief. Infuriating, Quinn finished, shooting her friend a glare. He can't see past his own nose. All he cares about is winning games, as if that's the only thing that matters. Maggie linked her arm through Quinn's, guiding her away from the crowd. Oh, honey. You know what they say about arguing, right? It's just foreplay for the stubborn. Quinn felt her cheeks flush hot. Maggie. It is not like that at all. Drew Carson is the last person I'd ever be interested in. Maggie nodded, clearly unconvinced. That's why you two can't keep your eyes off each other, even when you're at each other's throats. Or maybe especially then. Quinn opened her mouth to protest, but Maggie held up a hand. Save it, Quinn. I've known you since we were kids. I know that look in your eye. It's the same one you had when you were arguing with Tommy Peterson in debate club. And we all know how that turned out. That was different, Quinn mumbled, though she could feel her resolve weakening. Tommy wasn't so tall, dark, and brooding? Maggie supplied with a grin. Face it, Quinn. You've got it bad for Coach Hottie over there. The sooner you admit it, the sooner we can start planning your wedding on the beach. Quinn groaned, burying her face in her hands. You're impossible, you know that? Maggie laughed, patting Quinn on the back. That's why you love me. Now come on, let's go make sure the cleanup crew knows what they're doing. We can't have any stray footballs washing up on shore tomorrow morning. As Quinn allowed herself to be led away, she couldn't help but glance back at Drew. He was still surrounded by kids, laughing as he showed them how to properly grip a football. Despite her frustration, she couldn't deny the warmth that spread through her chest at the sight. Across the beach, Drew found his gaze drifting to Quinn as she walked away with Maggie. He watched the way the setting sun caught in her hair, turning it to fire. Even from a distance, he could see the tension in her shoulders, the slight furrow in her brow that appeared whenever she was deep in thought or annoyed. Knowing him, it was probably both. He sighed, tossing the football back to one of the kids. As much as Quinn frustrated him, he couldn't deny the pull he felt towards her. She was stubborn, yes, but also passionate and driven. The way her eyes lit up when she talked about her plans for the team, the fierce determination in her voice when she argued with him, it was intoxicating. But they were just so different. She was all about marketing and community engagement, while he knew that what really mattered was what happened on the field. How could they ever see eye to eye? Earth to Coach Carson, a voice broke through his thoughts. Drew blinked, realizing he'd been staring off into space. Ethan Cole, the team's quarterback, was standing in front of him with an amused expression. Sorry, Ethan, Drew said, shaking his head to clear it. What's up? Ethan grinned, glancing over his shoulder to where Quinn had disappeared. Nothing much. Just wanted to let you know how the high school kids did during the event. They were pretty impressive, especially considering the unique circumstances. Drew nodded, grateful for the distraction. That's great to hear. How did they handle the dog situation? As Ethan launched into a detailed account of the younger players' performance, Drew found himself only half listening. His mind kept drifting back to Quinn, to the fire in her eyes when she'd stood up to him. He respected her passion, even if he disagreed with her methods. And if he was being honest with himself, their arguments were becoming the highlight of his days. Coach? Ethan's voice broke through his thoughts again. You okay? You seem a little distracted. Drew forced a smile. I'm fine, just thinking about how we can incorporate some of today's chaos into our training. Keep the guys on their toes, you know? Ethan laughed. Sure, Coach. Just maybe leave out the part where we have to dodge excited puppies while running plays. As Drew chuckled in response, a commotion near the refreshment stand caught his attention. Lila, his sister, was gesticulating wildly, her voice carrying across the beach as she regaled a group of listeners with what appeared to be another of her infamous dating stories. And then, Lila was saying as Drew and Ethan approached, he tells me he's not actually a professional surfer, but a professional surf enthusiast. Which apparently means he watches surfing videos on YouTube all day and has never actually been on a board. The group around her erupted in laughter, and Drew couldn't help but smile. His sister had a knack for attracting the most colorful characters in her love life. Lila, he called out as they reached the group. Please tell me you're not traumatizing these nice people with your dating horror stories. Lila turned, her face lighting up at the sight of her brother. Drew? Just the man I wanted to see. Come here and tell these lovely folks about the time you tried to teach me how to throw a football and ended up breaking Mrs. Henderson's garden gnome. Drew groaned good-naturedly as he was pulled into the circle. That was 20 years ago, Lila. Are you ever going to let that go? Not a chance, big brother, Lila grinned, throwing an arm around his shoulders. Someone has to keep that ego of yours in check. As the group laughed, Lila's eyes scanned the beach, finally landing on Quinn, who was helping to stack chairs nearby. A mischievous glint appeared in her eye. Speaking of egos, she said, loud enough for Quinn to hear, what's the deal with you and our lovely town manager over there? That little argument earlier looked an awful lot like flirting to me. Quinn's head snapped up at Lila's words, her cheeks flushing as she realized everyone was looking at her. Drew felt his own face grow warm, acutely aware of the eyes now darting between him and Quinn. It wasn't flirting, Drew said firmly, at the same time Quinn called out, we were not flirting. Their simultaneous denial only seemed to amuse Lila more. Oh, really? Because from where I was standing, it looked like you two were about 5 seconds away from either punching each other or making out on the sand. The group erupted in laughter again, and Drew wished the ground would open up and swallow him whole. He risked a glance at Quinn, who looked equally mortified. All right, Drew said, holding up his hands in surrender. I think that's enough entertainment for one day. Don't we have a beach to clean up? As if on cue, the event coordinator began calling for volunteers to help with the cleanup. The crowd around Lila began to disperse, much to Drew's relief. As the sun dipped lower on the horizon, casting long shadows across the beach, Drew found himself gravitating towards Quinn. She was struggling with a particularly stubborn tent stake, muttering under her breath as she tugged at it. Need a hand, he offered, surprising himself with the gentleness in his voice. Quinn looked up, her expression guarded. I've got it, thanks. Drew watched her struggle for another moment, before speaking again. Look, about earlier? I may have been a bit harsh. This event, it wasn't a complete disaster. Quinn paused in her efforts, eyeing him suspiciously. Is that your way of admitting I was right? Drew couldn't help but chuckle. Let's not get carried away. I still think we need to focus more on our game strategy. But I can see how events like this might help build community support. Quinn's expression softened slightly. Well, that's something, I guess. They worked in silence for a few moments, Drew holding the tent steady while Quinn finally managed to pull the stake free. As they moved to the next tent, Drew found himself wanting to prolong their interaction. So, do you need help with anything else? He asked, gesturing vaguely at the cleanup efforts around them. Quinn looked surprised by his offer but nodded. Actually, yeah. There are some heavy coolers that need to be loaded into the truck. Think you can handle it, Coach? There was a hint of challenge in her voice, and Drew felt a familiar spark of competitiveness. I think I can manage. Lead the way, Matthews. As they made their way across the beach, weaving between volunteers and discarded beach gear, Drew found himself hyper-aware of Quinn's presence beside him. The scent of her perfume mingled with the salty sea air, and he had to resist the urge to lean in closer. They worked together efficiently, loading coolers and boxes into the waiting truck. Despite their earlier argument, Drew was surprised to find how well they functioned as a team when they weren't at each other's throats. As Quinn handed him the last box, their fingers brushed, sending an unexpected jolt through Drew's arm. He fumbled the box, nearly dropping it before recovering. Careful there, Coach, Quinn teased, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. We wouldn't want you to strain yourself. Drew felt his face warm, and he busied himself with arranging the box in the truck bed. I think I can handle a few boxes, Matthews. I'm not completely useless off the field, you know. Quinn leaned against the side of the truck, studying him with an unreadable expression. No, I suppose you're not. There was a moment of silence between them, filled with intention that Drew couldn't quite name. It wasn't the angry, frustrated energy of their earlier argument. This was something different, something that made his heart race and his palms sweat. Chapter 5: Time Out. Drew and Quinn worked in silence for a while, the tension between them still palpable. The rhythmic sound of waves crashing against the shore filled the air, punctuated by the occasional shout or laugh from the remaining volunteers scattered across the beach. As they folded up chairs and stacked them in neat piles, Drew couldn't help but steal glances at Quinn. Her brow was furrowed in concentration, a few wisps of hair escaping from her ponytail and framing her face. Feeling the need to break the awkward silence, Drew cleared his throat. "You know, I've got to hand it to you, Matthews. You sure know how to throw a party. I don't think I've ever seen so many dogs in football jerseys in my life." Quinn looked up, surprise flickering across her face. For a moment, Drew thought she might ignore him, but then a reluctant smile tugged at the corners of her mouth. "Well, I aim to please," she said, her tone lighter than it had been all day. "Though I have to admit, I didn't anticipate quite so much canine enthusiasm for the game." Drew chuckled, remembering the chaos of the halftime show. "Yeah, who knew Chihuahuas had such a talent for interceptions? Maybe we should consider drafting a few for the team." This time Quinn actually laughed, the sound warm and genuine. "Oh God, can you imagine? We'd have to redesign all the uniforms." The tension between them eased, like a tightly wound spring slowly uncoiling. As they continued to clean up, their conversation flowed more freely, the earlier hostility giving way to a cautious camaraderie. "I've got to admit," Drew said as he collapsed a folding table, "the crowd did seem to love it. I haven't heard cheering like that at one of our games in a long time." Quinn nodded, a hint of pride in her voice. "It was pretty great, wasn't it? I mean, sure, things got a little chaotic at times, but that's part of the charm, right?" Drew raised an eyebrow. "Chaotic? Is that what we're calling it when half the animal shelter decided to stage a revolt on the field?" Quinn rolled her eyes, but there was no real annoyance behind it. "Okay, fine. It was a complete disaster for about 10 minutes there. But admit it, Carson, it was pretty entertaining." Yeah, Drew conceded with a grin. "I suppose watching Big C try to wrangle that Great Dane was worth the price of admission alone." They shared a laugh, both picturing the burly coach's futile attempts to corral the enthusiastic dog. As their laughter faded, Drew found himself studying Quinn's face. In the fading light of the sunset, her eyes seemed to sparkle with a mix of exhaustion and triumph. "You know," he said, his voice softer than before, "I may have been a bit harsh earlier. This event, it wasn't what I expected, but I can see why you pushed for it. The team needs more than just practice to succeed." Quinn's expression softened, surprise and something else, maybe appreciation, flitting across her features. "Thanks, Drew. That means a lot coming from you." They worked in companionable silence for a few more minutes, the sound of the waves and distant chatter from the remaining volunteers creating a soothing backdrop. As they finished packing up the last of the equipment, Drew felt a wave of exhaustion wash over him. He leaned against the truck, running a hand through his hair. "God, I'm beat," he admitted. "I don't think I've been this tired since 2 days back in college." Quinn nodded, leaning next to him. "Tell me about it. I feel like I could sleep for a week." She paused, then added with a smirk, "Though I'm pretty sure my exhaustion is more mental than physical. Planning this event was like herding cats, or maybe football-playing dogs would be more accurate." Drew laughed, the sound rumbling deep in his chest. "Hey, don't sell yourself short. I saw you sprinting after those runaway Pomeranians. That's some serious cardio right there." Quinn groaned, but there was humor in her voice. "Don't remind me. I'm pretty sure I pulled muscles I didn't even know I had." As their laughter faded, a comfortable silence settled between them. Drew found himself staring out at the ocean, the setting sun painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. The beauty of it struck him, reminding him why he'd always loved this town even when his dreams had pulled him away. "You know," he said, his voice quiet and thoughtful, "I give you a hard time about all this community engagement stuff, but the truth is, I'm just scared." Quinn turned to look at him, surprise evident in her expression. Scared? You? Drew nodded, keeping his eyes on the horizon. Yeah. Scared that if we don't focus every second on improving our game, we'll fail. And if we fail? He trailed off, swallowing hard. If you fail, what? Quinn prompted gently. Drew sighed, finally turning to meet her gaze. If we fail, it'll be like losing my career all over again. Like I've let everyone down a second time. Quinn's eyes widened, understanding dawning on her face. Drew, I had no idea you felt that way. He shrugged, trying to play it off. Yeah, well, it's not exactly something I advertise, you know. But when my pro career ended early, it felt like I'd lost everything. Coming back here, coaching the Sharks, it's like a second chance. I can't mess it up. Quinn was quiet for a moment, her expression thoughtful. When she spoke, her voice was soft and understanding. I get it, Drew. I really do. But you're not alone in this. The whole town is behind the team, behind you. Today proved that. And yeah, maybe we have different ideas about how to make the Sharks successful, but we're on the same side here. Drew felt something loosen in his chest, a tension he hadn't even realized he'd been carrying. Thanks, Quinn. I appreciate that. They stood there for a moment, the silence between them no longer awkward or tense, but filled with a new understanding. Drew found himself studying Quinn's profile, noticing the way the fading sunlight caught the highlights in her hair, the determined set of her jaw that he'd once found irritating but now saw as a sign of her passion and drive. You know, he said, breaking the silence, I think I misjudged you when you first came back to town. I thought you were just some city slicker who didn't understand what the team meant to Oceanview. Quinn turned to him, a wry smile on her face. And I thought you were just some washed-up jock who couldn't see past the end of the football field. Drew winced, but there was no real hurt behind it. Ouch. Tell me how you really feel, Matthews. She laughed, the sound light and genuine. Hey, you started it. But for what it's worth, I think I misjudged you too. You're not just about football. You really care about this team, about this town. Quinn hesitated for a moment, her gaze drifting out to the darkening horizon. The soft lapping of waves against the shore filled the silence between them. She took a deep breath, the salty air filling her lungs, before turning back to Drew. You know, I have my own fears about all this, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Coming back here, taking on the team, it wasn't exactly part of my grand life plan. Drew raised an eyebrow, curiosity evident in his expression. Oh yeah? What was the plan then? Quinn let out a soft, self-deprecating laugh. Climb the corporate ladder, become a big-shot marketing executive, live the glamorous city life. She shook her head, a wry smile playing on her lips. Turns out the glamorous life isn't all it's cracked up to be. Drew nodded, understanding in his eyes. Burnout? You could say that, Quinn replied, running a hand through her hair. I was working myself to the bone, barely sleeping, living on coffee and takeout. And for what? To impress people I didn't even like? She sighed, her shoulders sagging slightly. When Dad passed away, it was like a wake-up call, you know? I realized I'd been so focused on proving myself to everyone else that I'd lost sight of what really mattered. Drew listened intently, his earlier irritation with Quinn fading as he saw a new side of her. So you came back home, he said softly. Quinn nodded. Yeah. I thought I'd just stay for a little while, help Mom sort things out. But then Coach Big C approached me about helping with the team, and she trailed off, gesturing vaguely at the beach around them. And now you're organizing charity events and wrangling football-playing dogs, Drew finished for her, a hint of amusement in his voice. Quinn laughed, the sound genuine and warm. Exactly. Not quite the career trajectory I had in mind. Drew studied her for a moment, noticing the way her eyes lit up when she laughed, the determined set of her jaw even as she spoke about her doubts. You know, he said slowly, I think you're doing a pretty good job, all things considered. I mean, yeah, your methods are unconventional. But you've got passion, and you're not afraid to take risks. That counts for something. Quinn looked up at him, surprise evident in her expression. Wow, Carson. Was that actually a compliment? Should I be worried? Drew rolled his eyes, but there was no real annoyance behind the gesture. Don't let it go to your head, Matthews. I still think you're a pain in the ass most of the time. Right back at you, Quinn retorted, but her tone was light, almost playful. They fell into a comfortable silence, both lost in thought. The sky had darkened considerably, the last streaks of orange and pink fading into deep blue. The first stars were beginning to twinkle overhead, and a cool breeze swept in from the ocean, carrying with it the promise of night. Drew broke the silence first, his voice thoughtful. You know, maybe we've both been going about this all wrong. Me with my obsession with practice and game strategy, you with your focus on community engagement and publicity. Quinn turned to him, curiosity piqued. What do you mean? Drew ran a hand through his hair, gathering his thoughts. I mean, maybe we need to find a balance. You're right that the team needs community support to survive, but I'm also right that we need to focus on improving our game. Maybe we can find a way to do both. Quinn nodded slowly, considering his words. You might be onto something there, Carson. A compromise, huh? Who would have thought? Drew chuckled, the sound low and warm. Yeah, well, don't get used to it. I still plan on giving you a hard time about your crazy ideas. I wouldn't have it any other way, Quinn replied with a grin. As they finished packing up the last of the equipment, a comfortable silence fell between them. The beach was nearly empty now, the last of the volunteers having headed home. The only sounds were the gentle lapping of waves against the shore and the distant cry of a seagull. They stood side by side, looking out over the darkened ocean. The moon had risen, casting a silvery path across the water. Quinn felt a strange sense of peace wash over her, a feeling she hadn't experienced in a long time. You know, she said softly, I forgot how beautiful it is here at night. In the city, you can barely see the stars with all the light pollution. Drew nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Yeah, it's pretty special. It's one of the things I missed most when I was playing pro ball. The big cities are exciting and all, but there's something about this place that just feels like home. Quinn turned to look at him, struck by the sincerity in his voice. In the moonlight, his profile was softened, the usual hard lines of concentration replaced by a more relaxed expression. For a moment she saw past the tough exterior of the football coach to the man underneath, a man who, like her, was trying to find his place in the world. Thanks for helping clean up, she said, breaking the silence. You didn't have to stay. Drew shrugged, a small smile playing on his lips. What kind of coach would I be if I made you do all the heavy lifting? Besides, someone had to make sure you didn't try to sneak any stray dogs home with you. Quinn laughed, the sound carrying across the empty beach. Please, as if I need any more chaos in my life right now. I think I've hit my quota for the year with this event. Drew turned to face her, his expression suddenly serious. Hey Quinn? Yeah. Today it was good. Different, but good. And I'm glad you're here. To help with the team, I mean. Quinn felt a warmth spread through her chest at his words. Thanks, Drew. That means a lot. Their eyes met, and for a moment the world seemed to fall away. Quinn found herself noticing things she hadn't before, the flecks of gold in Drew's green eyes, the way his brow furrowed slightly, as if he was trying to figure out a particularly tricky play. She felt a sudden urge to reach out, to bridge the gap between them. The moment was broken by the distant sound of a car horn. Quinn blinked, coming back to reality. She took a step back, suddenly aware of how close they had been standing. I should probably head home, she said, her voice slightly unsteady. It's getting late. Drew nodded, clearing his throat. Yeah, of course. I should get going too. Early practice tomorrow and all that. They gathered their things, the earlier ease between them replaced by a slightly awkward tension. As they reached the parking lot, Quinn turned to Drew one last time. Good night, Drew. And thanks again for your help. Drew smiled, a genuine warm smile that made Quinn's heart skip a beat. Anytime, Matthews. See you tomorrow. With a final nod, Quinn turned and walked towards her car. She could feel Drew's eyes on her as she went, and it took all her willpower not to look back. As she reached her vehicle, she allowed herself one glance over her shoulder. Drew was still standing there, his hands in his pockets, watching her go. Their eyes met once more, and Quinn felt a flutter in her stomach. She quickly got into her car, her mind whirling with conflicting emotions. As she drove home, Quinn couldn't help but replay the events of the day in her mind. The chaos of the event, the heated arguments with Drew, and then, that moment on the beach. She had come back to Oceanview to help save the team, to prove to herself that she could make a difference. She hadn't expected to find herself drawn to the very person who had been her biggest obstacle. Quinn shook her head, trying to clear her thoughts. It was probably nothing, she told herself. Just the aftermath of a long, emotional day. Tomorrow, things would be back to normal. She and Drew would go back to butting heads over team strategies, and this strange moment of connection would be forgotten. But as she pulled into her driveway, Quinn couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between them. Whether it was for better or worse, only time would tell. Meanwhile, back at the beach, Drew watched Quinn's car disappear into the night. He stood there for a long moment, his thoughts a jumbled mess. The day had been a whirlwind of emotions, frustration, excitement, and now, something he couldn't quite name. Quinn Matthews had infuriated him from the moment she arrived in town with her big ideas and city attitude. She challenged him at every turn, pushed him out of his comfort zone, and forced him to see things from a different perspective. And yet, standing there on the beach, sharing their fears and doubts, Drew had seen a side of her that he hadn't expected. He ran a hand through his hair, letting out a long breath. This was not part of the plan. He was supposed to focus on the team, on turning their losing streak around. He didn't have time for whatever this was. But as Drew finally turned to head to his own car, he couldn't deny the small spark of anticipation he felt at the thought of seeing Quinn again tomorrow. Maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to work together after all. As he drove home, the moon casting long shadows across the road, Drew found himself smiling despite his confusion. Whatever happened next, he had a feeling that life in Oceanview was about to get a lot more interesting. Chapter 6, Second Down. Quinn stared at her phone, thumb hovering over Drew's contact information. The shelter's director had called that morning, inviting her to see how they planned to use the funds from the charity event. Maggie's suggestion to invite Drew echoed in her mind. Just text him already, Maggie had said over coffee earlier, rolling her eyes. The way you two were looking at each other last night? There's definitely something there. We were exhausted, Quinn had protested. And possibly delirious from chasing escape dogs all afternoon. Now, sitting in her office at the stadium, Quinn typed and deleted 3 different messages before settling on something simple. Heading to Coastal Paws this afternoon to see the shelter improvements. Thought you might want to see where all that chaos went. 2 p.m. She hit send before she could overthink it, then immediately dropped her phone like it might bite her. When it buzzed less than a minute later, her stomach did a little flip. Sure. Meet you there. Quinn blinked at the screen. She hadn't actually expected him to say yes. The afternoon sun was bright as Quinn pulled into the shelter's parking lot. Drew's truck was already there, and she spotted him leaning against the hood, wearing a faded Sharks t-shirt and jeans instead of his usual coaching gear. He looked different somehow, more relaxed, less Coach Carson, and more just Drew. You're early, she said, approaching him. Had to finish practice ahead of schedule. One of the dogs got loose and ran onto the field. His lips twitched. Seems to be a recurring theme lately. Before Quinn could respond, the shelter's front door burst open, and Sarah, the volunteer coordinator, rushed out to greet them. Oh my goodness, Drew Carson. We haven't seen you in ages. She pulled Drew into a tight hug, which he returned with surprising warmth. And Quinn, thank you so much for organizing everything. The donations are going to help so many of our animals. Quinn watched, fascinated, as Drew chatted easily with Sarah about the shelter's recent adoptions. There was none of his usual gruff coach demeanor. Instead, he seemed genuinely interested and engaged. When Sarah led them inside, several other volunteers called out greetings to Drew by name. "I take it you're a regular here?" Quinn asked quietly, as they followed Sarah through the building. Drew shrugged, but there was something vulnerable in his expression. "Used to be. Haven't been back in a while." The tour took them through newly renovated areas where the donation money would be used. But it was when they reached the dog kennels that Quinn saw a completely different side of Drew. He stopped at each enclosure, talking softly to the dogs, letting them sniff his hand through the fence. His entire demeanor changed, gentler, more open. They reached a quiet corner of the shelter, where a large mixed-breed dog dozed in his kennel. Drew went still beside her. "This is Max," Sarah said. "He came in last week. Such a sweetie, but he's having trouble adjusting." Drew crouched down, and the dog lifted his head, brown eyes alert. "Hey buddy," he said softly. The dog's tail thumped against the floor. Sarah's phone buzzed. "Oh, excuse me, I need to take this. Feel free to look around, and let me know if you need anything." Once Sarah left, Drew remained crouched by Max's kennel, lost in thought. Quinn knelt beside him, careful to give him space. "He looks just like Cooper," Drew said finally, his voice rough. "My dog? Had him for 12 years, got him right here at this shelter when he was just a puppy. Lost him 2 years ago." Quinn's heart squeezed. "I'm so sorry. Cooper saw me through everything, the injury that ended my career, moving back home, starting over as a coach. He was..." Drew swallowed hard. "He was there for all of it. When he got sick, I couldn't..." He trailed off, reaching through the fence to let Max sniff his fingers. Without thinking, Quinn placed her hand on Drew's shoulder. She felt the tension in his muscles, the slight tremor running through him. "It's okay," she said softly. "I get it." Drew turned to look at her, their faces close. "Yeah?" Quinn nodded. "We had a cat growing up, Mr. Whiskers. Most unoriginal name ever, I know. But he was my best friend through middle school, high school, everything. When he died my freshman year of college, I cried for weeks." A ghost of a smile crossed Drew's face. "Mr. Whiskers? Hey, I was 6 when we got him. And he had very impressive whiskers." Drew laughed softly, and Quinn felt something warm bloom in her chest at the sound. They stayed there for a moment, sharing the quiet space while Max dozed nearby. "I haven't been back here since Cooper," Drew admitted. "Couldn't face it. But being here now..." He looked around the shelter, taking in the sounds of barking and meowing, the smell of kibble and cleaning supplies. "Maybe it's time." They spent the next hour walking through the shelter together. Drew told her stories about Cooper, how he used to steal Drew's socks, how he'd curl up next to Drew during game film reviews, how he seemed to know exactly when Drew needed comfort after a tough loss. In return, Quinn shared tales of Mr. Whisker's adventures, including the time he got stuck in a tree and her dad had to rescue him with a ladder and a can of tuna. As they talked, Quinn noticed how Drew's hand would occasionally brush against hers as they walked, how he'd lean in close to share a particular memory. The usual tension between them had transformed into something different, softer, more intimate. They ended up back at Max's kennel. The dog had moved closer to the fence, his tail wagging as Drew approached. "You know," Quinn said carefully, "he really seems to like you." Drew reached through the fence again, letting Max lick his hand. "Yeah," he said quietly. "He does." Quinn watched as Drew's eyes grew distant, knew he was thinking about Cooper. Without hesitation, she reached out and took his free hand in hers, squeezing gently. Drew's fingers tightened around hers, and they stood there together, watching Max drift back to sleep. The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken understanding. Quinn realized she was still holding Drew's hand, but she couldn't bring herself to let go. For once their usual walls were down, and she found herself wanting to stay in this quiet bubble where Drew wasn't just the frustrated coach, and she wasn't just the city girl trying to save the team. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the shelter's parking lot, as Quinn and Drew settled onto a weathered wooden bench near the entrance. A gentle breeze carried the salt-tinged air from the nearby ocean, ruffling Quinn's hair. She tucked a loose strand behind her ear, aware of Drew's presence beside her, close but not too close, that careful space between them charged with something new and uncertain. "So," Drew said, stretching his legs out in front of him. "Never thought I'd spend my afternoon touring an animal shelter with you." Quinn laughed. "What, did you think I'd be too busy color-coding spreadsheets?" "Something like that." He turned to look at her, his green eyes catching the sunlight. "Speaking of spreadsheets, what made you leave all that behind? The big city marketing job must have been more exciting than managing our ragtag team." Quinn's fingers traced the bench's worn grain, considering her answer. "Exciting isn't always good. I was working 70-hour weeks, living on coffee and takeout. My apartment view was another office building, and I couldn't tell you the name of a single neighbor." She shook her head. "One day, I was sitting in this big client meeting, watching everyone argue about font choices for a toothpaste ad, and I just broke." "Broke?" Drew shifted slightly, angling his body toward her. "I started laughing. Couldn't stop. Everyone stared at me like I'd lost my mind, and maybe I had." Quinn smiled ruefully. "I walked out of that meeting, went straight to my boss's office, and quit. Packed up my desk while my hands were still shaking." Drew whistled low. "That's bold. Or stupid. The jury's still out." Quinn looked across the parking lot, watching a couple lead their newly adopted puppy to their car. "I came back here thinking it would be temporary. Just long enough to figure out my next move. But now?" She gestured vaguely. "I'm not sure what that move should be. Or if I even want to make one." "Yeah." Drew's voice was quiet. "I get that." Quinn turned to him, surprised by the understanding in his tone. "You do?" Drew leaned back, his shoulder brushing hers. "When I got injured, everyone kept asking what my backup plan was. Like I was supposed to have this whole other life mapped out just waiting in the wings." He laughed, but there was an edge to it. "Truth is, I never had one. Football was it for me. And now?" He trailed off, running a hand through his hair. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm coaching the Sharks because I want to, or because I don't know what else to do." "But you're good at it," Quinn said softly. "The players respect you. They trust you." "Maybe. But is that enough?" Drew's eyes met hers. "Don't get me wrong, I love this team. These guys put everything they have into every game, even though they're not getting million-dollar contracts or ESPN coverage. But sometimes I wake up wondering if I'm stuck here, if I settled for this because I was too scared to try for something bigger." Quinn felt the weight of his confession settle between them. It was strange, seeing this vulnerable side of Drew, the man who always seemed so confident on the field, now admitting to the same uncertainties that kept her up at night. "For what it's worth," she said, "I don't think you settled. I think you found something real here. Something that matters." Drew's lips curved into a small smile. "Yeah? And what about you? Think you might find something that matters here too?" Quinn's heart skipped at the way he looked at her, earnest and hopeful, so different from their usual sparring. Before she could overthink it, she heard herself say, "Want to grab dinner? We could figure it out together." Drew's eyebrows shot up and a slow grin spread across his face. "Quinn Matthews, are you asking me out?" "I'm suggesting we continue this conversation somewhere with food," she corrected, fighting her own smile. "Don't get ahead of yourself, Carson." No, this is definitely you asking me out." He stood up, extending his hand to help her up. "I should mark this day on my calendar. The day the city girl finally fell for my small-town charm." Quinn rolled her eyes but took his hand, letting him pull her to her feet. "Your ego is showing, Coach." "Can't help it. It's not every day a beautiful woman asks me to dinner after spending the afternoon looking at sheltered dogs." Quinn felt her cheeks warm at the compliment even as she shot back, "I'm starting to regret this already." "No, you're not." Drew's hand was still holding hers, his thumb brushing lightly across her knuckles. "No," Quinn admitted softly. "I'm not." They walked to their cars together, their steps slow, neither seeming eager to end the moment. When they reached Quinn's car, Drew leaned against the driver's side door, effectively blocking her path. "So," he said, "where are you taking me for this not-a-date dinner?" Quinn stepped closer, close enough to catch the faint scent of his cologne mixed with the salty air. "I was thinking Mario's. Unless you have a better suggestion?" Drew's eyes dropped to her lips for just a moment before meeting her gaze again. "Mario sounds perfect. Meet you there in 20 minutes, Quinn agreed, her voice slightly breathless. Drew pushed off her car, stepping back just enough to let her open the door. As Quinn slid into the driver's seat, he bent down, one hand resting on the car roof. "Hey, Quinn?" "Yeah. I'm glad you came back to town." Before she could respond, he straightened up and headed for his truck, leaving Quinn sitting there with her heart racing and a smile she couldn't quite suppress. As she watched him walk away in her rearview mirror, she realized that for the first time since coming back to Oceanview, she was glad too. Chapter 7, Red Zone. The morning sun beat down on the practice field as Drew paced the sidelines, his clipboard forgotten in his hands. The Sharks were running drills, but his mind kept circling back to their final game against the Riverview Raiders. 3 days. They had 3 days to get everything perfect. "Again," he called out as Ethan's pass went wide. "Focus on your footwork, Cole. Tank, tighten up that coverage." Movement at the edge of the field caught his attention. A familiar figure in an expensive suit stood watching the practice, and Drew's stomach dropped. Jack Morrison, head coach of the Atlantic Titans, a team 2 divisions above the Sharks. Drew hadn't seen him since his playing days. "Take 5, guys," Drew shouted, trying to keep his voice neutral. He watched as Morrison made his way across the field, that characteristic predatory smile on his face. "Carson," Morrison called out. "Looking good out there. Your boys have some real potential." Drew crossed his arms. "Jack, didn't expect to see you slumming it at a semi-pro practice." "Come on now, is that any way to greet an old friend?" Morrison's smile widened. "Actually, I'm here to talk business. Got a minute?" They moved to the shade of the equipment shed, away from curious eyes. Morrison didn't waste time with small talk. "I need an offensive coordinator," he said. "Someone who knows the game inside and out, someone who can connect with players. Someone like you." Drew's heart skipped. The Titans were just 2 steps away from the NFL. It was the kind of opportunity he dreamed about before his injury, the kind that didn't come around twice. "I appreciate the offer, Jack, but I've got a team here." "A team that's 1 bad season away from folding," Morrison countered. "Look, I know you've got loyalty to these guys, but this is the big leagues, Drew. The salary alone is triple what you're making here, plus benefits, housing allowance, the works." Drew watched his players running drills. Tank was showing one of the younger guys a better stance, while Ethan worked with the receivers. His team. His guys. "When do you need an answer?" "End of the week." Morrison pulled out a business card. "Think about it, Carson. This could be your second chance at the big time." Drew took the card, feeling its weight like an anchor in his pocket as Morrison walked away. The rest of practice passed in a blur, his mind spinning with possibilities and doubts. That evening, he sat in his office long after everyone had left, staring at Morrison's card. The Titans logo gleamed under the fluorescent lights, promising everything he'd once wanted. But now? He thought about Quinn's smile during their dinner at Mario's last week, the way she'd laughed at his terrible jokes. He thought about Tank's wedding coming up, where the whole team would be groomsmen. About Ethan's high school mentorship program that was just getting off the ground. When had this small-town team become so much more than just a backup plan? The next morning's team meeting felt like walking through fog. Drew went through the motions, reviewing plays and strategies, but his heart wasn't in it. Quinn kept shooting him concerned looks from her spot by the whiteboard, where she was presenting the latest fundraising numbers. After the meeting, she cornered him in the hallway. "Okay, what's going on?" "Nothing's going on," Drew said, not meeting her eyes. "Just focused on the game." "Right?" Quinn stepped closer, forcing him to look at her. "That's why you barely said 2 words during the meeting, and haven't returned any of my texts since Tuesday? Drew sighed, running a hand through his hair. It's complicated. Try me. Her voice softened. Drew, if I did something wrong. No, he cut her off quickly. God, no. Quinn, you haven't done anything wrong. It's just. He pulled Morrison's card from his pocket, turning it over in his hands. Jack Morrison showed up at practice yesterday. Offered me a coaching position with the Titans. Quinn's eyes widened. The Atlantic Titans? Drew, that's incredible. Yeah, he said quietly. It's what I always wanted. Before the injury, this was the dream, coaching at this level, working my way up to the NFL. But? Quinn prompted, reading his hesitation. But now? Drew leaned against the wall, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on him. Now I look at this team, at what we're building here at U. He trailed off, watching a blush creep across her cheeks. And I'm not sure if that dream fits anymore. Quinn was quiet for a moment, studying his face. When do you have to decide? End of the week. She nodded slowly. That's not much time. No, Drew agreed. It's not. They stood in silence, the space between them heavy with unspoken words. Finally, Quinn reached out and squeezed his arm gently. Whatever you decide, she said softly, just make sure it's what you really want, not what you think you should want. Drew caught her hand before she could pull away, holding it against his chest. Quinn, The door to the conference room burst open as players started filing out, breaking the moment. Quinn stepped back, her hand slipping from his grasp. I should go, she said. I have meetings with sponsors all afternoon. Drew watched her walk away, Morrison's card burning a hole in his pocket. The choice loomed before him: chase his old dreams or stay and build something new. Either way, he had 3 days to decide, and no idea which path to take. Quinn stood rooted to the spot in the hallway, her heart hammering against her ribs as Drew's words hung in the air. The Atlantic Titans. It was a huge opportunity, the kind that could launch him straight back into the big leagues. She forced her face into what she hoped was an encouraging smile. Maybe we should talk about this somewhere more private, she suggested, glancing at the steady stream of players still filing past them. Drew nodded, leading her to his office. The small space felt even smaller with both of them inside, the air thick with tension. He dropped into his chair while Quinn perched on the edge of his desk, her legs crossed at the ankles. How long have you known about this offer? She asked, proud of how steady her voice sounded. Morrison showed up at practice yesterday. Drew ran a hand through his hair, making it stick up in ways that Quinn definitely shouldn't find adorable. It's triple the salary, plus benefits. The whole package. Wow. Quinn picked at an invisible thread on her sleeve. That's amazing, Drew. Really? He studied her face. You don't sound convinced. No, I am. The words came out too quickly. I mean, of course I am. This is what you've always wanted, right? Getting back to that level? Drew stood up suddenly, pacing the small space. That's just it. I thought it was what I wanted. Before the injury, this kind of opportunity would have been a no-brainer. And now? Now? He stopped pacing, turning to face her. Now I look at what we're building here, what the team is building, and I'm not sure anymore. These guys depend on me. We've got the Raiders game coming up, Tank's wedding, Ethan's mentorship program. Quinn's throat tightened. You can't make career decisions based on other people's lives, Drew. Why not? Isn't that exactly what you did when you left the city? The words hit her like a physical blow. That was different. Was it? Drew stepped closer, his green eyes intense. You had the perfect corporate job, the corner office, everything you thought you wanted. But something made you walk away. Because I was burning out. Quinn stood up, needing to move. I wasn't sleeping, I wasn't eating. I was just existing. This town, this team, it gave me a chance to breathe again. And maybe that's what this team does for me too. Drew's voice softened. Maybe staying isn't settling. Maybe it's finally figuring out what actually matters. Quinn's heart skipped. What does matter to you, Drew? The air between them crackled with possibility. Drew took another step forward, close enough now that Quinn could smell his cologne. Quinn, A sharp knock at the door made them both jump. Tank's voice boomed through the wood. Coach, we need you on the field. The new plays aren't clicking. Drew closed his eyes, frustration evident in the set of his jaw. Be right there. He looked at Quinn, apologetically. I should go, she said quickly, stepping back. They need you. He hesitated at the door. This conversation isn't over. No, Quinn agreed softly. I suppose it isn't. She watched him walk away, her emotions a tangled mess. The rational part of her brain knew she should encourage him to take the Titans' job. It was an incredible opportunity, exactly what he deserved. But the thought of him leaving made her chest ache in ways she wasn't ready to examine. Later that evening, sprawled on her couch with a glass of wine, Quinn heard the familiar rhythm of Lila's knock. I brought reinforcements, Lila announced, holding up a paper bag that smelled suspiciously like Mario's garlic knots. Also, you'll never believe what happened on my date last night. Quinn managed a weak smile. Do I want to know? Oh, you definitely want to know. Lila flopped onto the couch, pulling out the food. Picture this, we're at that new fusion place downtown, everything's going great, and then his ex-wife shows up. As our waitress. Despite herself, Quinn laughed. No way. Way? And the best part? They both pretended not to know each other the entire time. It was like watching really bad community theater. Your dating life is better than reality TV. Lila grinned, passing Quinn a garlic knot. That's why I keep doing it. The stories alone are worth the emotional damage. She studied Quinn's face. Speaking of emotional damage, what's got you looking like someone kicked your puppy? Quinn picked at her food. Your brother got a job offer. From the Atlantic Titans. Holy shit. Lila sat up straighter. That's wow. Is he going to take it? I don't know. We kind of got interrupted before we could finish talking about it. And how do you feel about it? Quinn took a large sip of wine. I feel like I should be happy for him. But nothing. That's how I should feel, so that's how I feel. Lila snorted. Right? Because you're definitely not sitting here moping about the possibility of him leaving. Just like you definitely haven't been making heart eyes at each other for weeks. I do not make heart eyes. Please. Lila rolled her eyes. You two have more chemistry than my entire dating history combined. And that's saying something, considering I once dated identical twins. Quinn choked on her wine. You what? Not at the same time. Lila paused. Well, not technically. There might have been some overlap, but in my defense, they were really hard to tell apart. Quinn laughed, grateful for the distraction. You're insane. Maybe. But at least I'm honest about my feelings. Lila's voice turned serious. Look, I know my brother. He's got a lot of complicated feelings about football and his injury and what he deserves. But I've never seen him look at anyone the way he looks at you. Quinn's chest tightened. That's not, we're just. Yeah. You're just colleagues. Keep telling yourself that. Lila stood up, gathering her things. Just don't let him make this decision without knowing all the facts, okay? After Lila left, Quinn sat in the quiet of her apartment, thinking about Drew's face when he talked about the team. About the way he lit up during practices. How he knew exactly what each player needed to succeed. How different he seemed from the man she'd first met, so focused on proving himself that he couldn't see what was right in front of him. The next morning, watching him run practice with intense focus, Quinn could see the weight of the decision in every line of his body. He barked orders with more force than usual, pushed the players harder, as if trying to prove something to himself. Their eyes met across the field, and for a moment everything else fell away. Then Drew turned back to the team, and Quinn buried herself in paperwork, both of them pretending they weren't counting down the days until everything might change. Chapter 8, Fourth Quarter. Quinn stared at her laptop screen, reading the email for the fourth time. The words hadn't changed: Senior Marketing Director, competitive salary, corner office overlooking the city. Everything she'd wanted 6 months ago, wrapped up in a neat digital bow. Her phone buzzed with a text from Drew about practice schedules, and her stomach did that annoying flip it had started doing whenever she saw his name. She closed the email without responding, but it lingered in her mind like a persistent itch she couldn't scratch. At the stadium, she fumbled through her usual routine, nearly colliding with Tank as he jogged past. "Oh, Matthews?" He steadied her with a massive hand. "You good?" "Fine," she mumbled, clutching her clipboard tighter. "Just thinking." The morning dragged on in a haze of paperwork and budget meetings. Quinn caught herself zoning out during Big C's strategy session, her mind wandering to glass-walled conference rooms and power lunches. By early afternoon, she needed caffeine and perspective. The bell above Seaside Sips chimed as she pushed through the door, the familiar scent of coffee and sea salt wrapping around her like a warm hug. Maggie took one look at her face and started making her usual order. "Okay, Spill. What's with the lost puppy look?" Quinn slumped onto a bar stool. "My old firm wants me back. Senior Marketing Director position." "Ah?" Maggie slid a steaming latte across the counter, complete with a perfectly foamed seahorse on top. "And this is bad news because I don't know if it's what I want anymore." Quinn traced the rim of her mug. 6 months ago, I would have jumped at this offer. Now there's the team. And a certain ruggedly handsome coach. Quinn groaned. "It's not about Drew." "Isn't it?" "At least partly." "It's about..." Quinn struggled to find the words. "When I came back here, I thought it was temporary. Just until I got my head straight. But the team needs help, and I'm actually making a difference here. In the city, I was just another cog in the machine." Maggie leaned against the counter. "Sounds like you already know what makes you happy." "That's the thing, I don't. The city was killing me, but it was also exciting. Important. Here, I'm planning charity events and wrestling with spreadsheets for a semi-pro football team that might not even survive the season. And loving every minute of it." Quinn opened her mouth to argue, then closed it. "Look," Maggie said, wiping down the counter with practice moves, "I can't tell you what to do. But I remember how you looked when you first came back, like you were carrying the weight of the world. Now, even with all the team drama and the Drew situation, you seem lighter. More yourself." "Maybe." Quinn sipped her latte, letting the warmth settle in her chest. "I just wish the timing wasn't so terrible. Everything's so uncertain with the team right now." "When is anything ever certain?" Maggie raised an eyebrow. "Besides my coffee being better than that overpriced city stuff." That earned a small laugh from Quinn. No contest there. Back at practice, Quinn tried to focus on the players running drills, but her attention kept drifting to her phone, where the email sat unanswered. She was so distracted, she didn't notice Drew approaching until he was right beside her. "Either that clipboard is showing you the meaning of life, or something's wrong." She startled, nearly dropping her pen. "Jesus, Carson. Wear a bell or something. Where's your head at, Matthews?" His voice was softer than usual, concern creeping in at the edges. "You've been off all day." Quinn glanced up at him, taking in the worried crease between his eyebrows. She thought about telling him about the email, about adding one more complication to their already tangled situation. But with his own career decision looming, it didn't seem fair. "Just tired," she lied, forcing a smile. "Lot of numbers to crunch before the final game." Drew studied her face for a long moment, clearly not buying it. "You know you can talk to me, right? Even with everything else." "I know." She did know, and that was part of the problem. Somewhere between arguments and charity events and quiet moments of understanding, Drew Carson had become someone she trusted. Someone whose opinion mattered. He opened his mouth to say more, but Ethan called him over to check a play formation. Drew hesitated, his hand brushing her arm briefly before he jogged away. Quinn watched him go, the weight of two life-changing decisions pressing down on her shoulders. The city email promised security, a return to the familiar. But as she watched Drew with the team, saw the easy way he commanded respect while building confidence, she wondered if familiar was what she really wanted anymore. She pulled out her phone, thumb hovering over the email. Before she could do anything, another text from Drew popped up. "Whatever it is, we'll figure it out." Quinn closed her eyes, letting out a shaky breath. She didn't know what she wanted, but she knew one thing: she wasn't ready to leave. Not yet. Not without seeing where this whole complicated mess might lead. She tucked her phone away and turned back to practice, pushing thoughts of corner offices and city lights aside. For now, she had a team to help save, even if she wasn't sure she'd be there to see it through. Quinn found Drew in the equipment room after practice, methodically organizing footballs like they held the secrets to the universe. The familiar scent of leather and grass filled the small space, making it feel even more intimate than she'd expected. "Hey," she said softly, causing him to look up. "Got a minute?" Drew's hands stilled on the football he was holding. "For you? Maybe even two." His attempt at humor fell flat when he saw her expression. "What's wrong?" Quinn leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed protectively over her chest. "I got an offer. From my old firm in the city." The football dropped from Drew's hands, landing with a dull thud on the padded floor. "Oh. Senior Marketing Director position." She watched his face carefully, searching for a reaction. "Corner office, bigger salary, the whole package." Drew picked up the football again, his movements deliberate. "Sounds like everything you left behind." "That's the thing." Quinn moved further into the room, perching on a stack of practice mats. "I'm not sure if that's good or bad anymore." He set the football aside and turned to face her fully. "What are you thinking?" "That's just it, I don't know what to think." She ran a hand through her ponytail, frustrated. 6 months ago, this would have been a no-brainer. But now? "Now there's the team," Drew finished, his voice careful. "The team, the town." Quinn met his eyes. "Other things." The air between them felt charged, heavy with unspoken words. Drew took a step closer, then seemed to think better of it. "You know," he said, "it's funny. I've been wrestling with something similar." "The rival coach's offer?" He nodded. "I keep thinking about what I wanted before, the big leagues, the prestige. But when I imagine leaving now..." He gestured vaguely at the room around them. "It feels different," Quinn finished. "Yeah." Drew sank down onto the mats beside her, careful to leave space between them. "I'm terrified of failing the team if I stay, but I'm equally scared of regret if I go." Quinn turned to look at him, surprised by his honesty. "I get that. In the city, I was always chasing the next big thing, never satisfied. Here, everything's slower, messier, but more real?" "Exactly." She smiled sadly. "But what if I go back to the city and realize I made a huge mistake? Or what if I stay here and wake up in 5 years wondering what could have been?" Drew's hand moved closer to hers on the mat, not quite touching. "Maybe there's no right answer. Maybe we just have to trust our gut." "My gut's been pretty unreliable lately," Quinn admitted. "It keeps getting distracted by..." She trailed off, feeling heat rise to her cheeks. Drew's fingers brushed against hers, sending electricity up her arm. "Yeah, mine too." Before either could say more, Big C's voice boomed from the hallway. "Carson, Matthews. Tell me you're not hiding from practice prep." They jumped apart like guilty teenagers. Drew cleared his throat. "In here, coach. Just doing equipment inventory." Big C appeared in the doorway, his expression knowing. "Well, unless those footballs are giving you winning plays for Saturday's game, we've got work to do." He fixed them both with a stern look. "This game isn't just about the team anymore, it's about proving we belong here. That the Sharks matter." Quinn stood up quickly, smoothing her clothes. Right, of course. I should check on the ticket sales anyway. And I need to review game footage, Drew added, a bit too quickly. Big C looked between them, shaking his head. Whatever's going on with you two, remember, the team comes first. At least until after Saturday. After he left, Quinn and Drew shared a look that said everything they couldn't voice. The game would change things, one way or another. They both knew it. Later that evening, Quinn paced her living room, her laptop open on the coffee table displaying the email from her old firm. The cursor blinked mockingly at her as she moved back and forth, wearing a path in her carpet. Her phone buzzed with texts from Maggie about cafe expansion plans, from Ethan about youth league schedules, from Tank about protein shake recommendations. Each message felt like a tiny anchor, tethering her to this place she'd never meant to stay. She stopped at her window, looking out at the ocean in the distance. The city had skyscrapers and sophisticated restaurants, but it never had this sense of peace, of belonging. Even on her most stressed days here, she felt more centered than she had in years of corporate climbing. But was that enough? Quinn clicked back to her email draft, staring at the blank response. Her fingers hovered over the keys, but no words came. Across town, Drew sat alone in the darkened stadium, tossing a football up and catching it with practiced ease. The rhythmic motion helped him think, or at least it usually did. Tonight, his thoughts were as scattered as incomplete passes. The rival coach's offer was everything he dreamed of when his playing career ended. A chance to prove himself at a higher level, to show he wasn't just some washed-up player hiding in his hometown. But every time he imagined accepting, he saw Quinn's face when he told her about leaving. He saw his players, who trusted him to lead them. He saw the town that had supported him through his darkest days. The football slipped through his fingers, bouncing away into the shadows. Drew leaned back in his seat, staring up at the stars visible through the stadium lights. "What would you do, Dad?" he whispered to the night air. His father had always said home was where you made it, not where circumstance placed you. But he'd also taught Drew to chase his dreams, no matter how far they took him. Drew's phone lit up with a message, Quinn, sending him updated stats for Saturday's game. His heart did that familiar skip it always did when he saw her name. He thought about their conversation in the equipment room, about all the things left unsaid between them. The final game loomed ahead like a finish line, but neither of them knew what waited on the other side. Drew picked up the football again, its worn surface familiar under his fingers. For now, this was what he could focus on: the game, the team, the next play. Everything else would have to wait. But as he sat there in the quiet stadium, he couldn't help wondering if some decisions were bigger than football, bigger than career moves and logical choices. He wondered if sometimes the heart knew better than the head, even when it made no sense at all. The stadium lights clicked off automatically, leaving him in darkness. Drew stood, tucking the football under his arm. Whatever happened after Saturday's game, he knew one thing: he wasn't ready to walk away. Not from the team, not from this town, and definitely not from Quinn Matthews. Chapter 9, 2-Minute Warning. The morning sun blazed over the stadium as Quinn triple-checked her clipboard, fighting the urge to reorganize the already perfectly arranged programs for the 10th time. Around her, the buzz of anticipation filled the air as fans streamed through the gates, many wearing the navy and silver of the Sharks. She'd never seen the stands this full. "Quite the turnout," Maggie said, appearing at Quinn's side with 2 cups of coffee. "Though I'm pretty sure you've memorized that clipboard by now." Quinn accepted the coffee gratefully. "I just want everything to be perfect. The sponsors are here, the press is here." She trailed off, spotting a familiar figure in an expensive suit up in the stands, the rival coach who'd made Drew the offer. Her stomach twisted. "And that's the only reason you're nervous?" Maggie raised an eyebrow. "Nothing to do with a certain coach?" "I have no idea what you're talking about." Quinn busied herself straightening a stack of programs that didn't need straightening. The email from her old firm burned in her inbox, still unanswered. Every time she thought about responding, something held her back. Maybe it was the way the town had embraced her efforts with the team. Maybe it was the satisfaction of building something real, something that mattered. Or maybe it was the way Drew looked at her when he thought she wasn't paying attention. In the locker room, Drew paced back and forth, his usual pre-game energy replaced by an intense focus that had the players exchanging worried glances. He'd barely said 2 words during warm-ups, lost in his own thoughts. "Hey coach," Ethan called out, adjusting his shoulder pads. "You're making me dizzy with all that pacing." Drew stopped, forcing a smile. "Just reviewing plays in my head." But his eyes kept drifting to the window, where he could see more fans filing into the stadium. Somewhere up there sat a man offering him everything he'd thought he wanted. So why did it feel like taking that offer would mean losing everything that mattered? The first quarter started rough. Tank missed an easy tackle, Blaze dropped a perfect pass, and Ethan's throws were off target. The opposing team scored twice in quick succession, and the energy in the stadium deflated with each point. Quinn watched from the sidelines, her clipboard forgotten as she tracked Drew's increasing frustration. He called timeout after timeout, but nothing seemed to click. The players looked tight, overthinking every move instead of playing with their usual fluid grace. "Come on, guys," Drew muttered, running his hands through his hair as another play fell apart. "What are we doing out there?" Quinn wanted to say something, to offer support or suggestions, but the distance between them felt wider than the field. They'd barely spoken since their conversation about leaving, both afraid to break the fragile peace they'd established. As halftime approached, the Sharks trudged into the locker room down by 17 points. Quinn followed, hanging back near the door as Drew faced his team. The silence was heavy, broken only by the sound of cleats on concrete and heavy breathing. "Look," Drew started, his voice low but intense. "I know what everyone's thinking. That we're just some small-town team. That we don't belong here. That we're in over our heads." He paused, looking each player in the eye. "But you know what? They're wrong. Every single one of them is wrong. Because I've seen what this team can do. I've seen Tank hit like a freight train. I've seen Blaze outrun guys twice his size. I've seen Ethan thread passes through impossible gaps." His voice grew stronger, filling the room. "This isn't about them. It's not about the scouts in the stands, or the headlines tomorrow. It's about us. About this team. About this town that shows up every single week because they believe in what we're building here." Quinn felt her throat tighten as Drew continued. "You want to know why I love coaching this team? Because none of you are here for the glory. You're here because you love the game. Because you believe in each other. Because when everything else changes, this team, this family stays constant." The players straightened, energy returning to their tired bodies as Drew's words sank in. "So forget about perfect plays. Forget about pressure. Just go out there and play like I know you can. Play for each other. Play for this town. Play because you love it." Quinn pressed her hand against the wall, steadying herself as emotion washed over her. This was the Drew she'd glimpsed beneath the cocky exterior, passionate, caring, devoted to his team. The Drew who made her question everything she thought she wanted. As the players began to rise, newfound determination in their faces, Drew's eyes met Quinn's across the room. For a moment, everything else faded away, the game, the decisions hanging over them, the uncertainty of their future. In that look, Quinn saw everything she needed to know about where she belonged. The whistle blew, calling the teams back to the field. Drew lingered for a moment, and Quinn found herself stepping forward, drawn by something stronger than logic or career plans. "That was quite a speech, Coach," she said softly. "Yeah, well." He gave her a half-smile that made her heart skip. "Sometimes you have to remind people what they're fighting for." Their eyes held for another beat before Drew turned to follow his team. Quinn watched him go, realizing that maybe she needed that reminder too. Because standing there in a small-town stadium with everything on the line, she finally understood what she was fighting for as well. The second half opened with an electricity that Quinn could feel crackling through the stadium. She gripped her clipboard tighter, watching as Drew sent in a play that had Tank breaking through the defensive line like a battering ram. The crowd roared as the Sharks gained crucial yards. That's what I'm talking about," Drew shouted from the sideline, his earlier hesitation replaced by fierce determination. Quinn couldn't help but smile at his intensity, the way he lived and breathed every play alongside his team. Ethan connected with Blaze for a spectacular touchdown that brought them within 3 points. The stadium vibrated with energy as fans stomped and cheered, the sound echoing across the field. Quinn found herself jumping up and down, professionalism forgotten in the excitement of the moment. With 5 minutes left on the clock, Drew called a timeout. Quinn watched as he gathered the team around him, his voice steady despite the pressure. "We've got this," she heard him say. "Trust yourselves. Trust each other." The players nodded, their faces set with determination as they returned to the field. Quinn noticed the rival coach leaning forward in his seat, watching Drew intently. She pushed away the twinge of anxiety that brought, and focused on the game. Drew's next call was bold, a fake handoff that had the defense scrambling as Ethan found an opening. The ball spiraled through the air, seeming to hang there forever before Blaze snatched it away from 2 defenders. The crowd exploded as he sprinted into the end zone, putting the Sharks ahead by 4 points. 3 minutes left. The opposing team drove down the field with desperate efficiency. Quinn's heart pounded as she watched the seconds tick away. 2 minutes. 1 minute 30 seconds. The other team was in scoring position. Drew paced the sideline, calling adjustments to his defense. Tank read the opposing quarterback's eyes perfectly, stepping into the passing lane just as the ball was released. The interception was clean, and the stadium erupted into chaos. The final minute was a blur of perfectly executed plays as the Sharks ran down the clock. When the final whistle blew, the field became a sea of navy and silver as fans poured from the stands. Players lifted each other onto their shoulders, their faces split with grins of pure joy. Quinn stood rooted to the spot, watching as Drew was mobbed by his team. He was laughing, accepting hugs and high fives, but she could see something else in his expression, a mix of pride and pain that made her heart ache. His eyes scanned the crowd until they found hers, and everything else seemed to fade away. The celebration swirled around them like a tide, but neither moved. Drew's face softened as he looked at her, and Quinn felt her breath catch. After what felt like an eternity, he began making his way through the crowd toward her. "Hell of a game," she said when he reached her, trying to keep her voice steady. "Hell of a season," he replied quietly. The noise of the celebration seemed distant now, as if they were in their own bubble. Drew ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she'd come to recognize as nervousness. "Quinn, Not here," she interrupted, glancing at the reporters already pushing their way through the crowd. Drew nodded, understanding in his eyes. Without a word, he reached for her hand. His palm was warm against hers, fingers intertwining with a certainty that made her pulse quicken. He led her away from the chaos, past the parking lot, toward the path that led to the beach. The sound of waves gradually replaced the stadium noise as they walked in comfortable silence. The setting sun painted the sky in streaks of orange and pink, casting long shadows across the sand. Quinn could feel the weight of everything unsaid between them, but for now, she just held on to his hand, letting the moment stretch out like the horizon before them. Drew's thumb traced small circles on her palm as they walked, each touch sending tingles up her arm. The gesture felt intimate, meaningful in a way that made Quinn's chest tight with emotion. Whatever came next would change everything, but right now, with the salt air on her face and Drew's hand in hers, she felt more certain than she had in months. They reached a quiet stretch of beach, far enough from the stadium that the celebration was just a distant murmur. Drew slowed to a stop but didn't let go of her hand. The waves crashed steadily against the shore, providing a rhythm to their shared silence. "You know," Drew said finally, his voice soft but clear over the sound of the ocean, "I've been standing on this beach since I was a kid trying to figure out what I wanted." He turned to face her, and Quinn's breath caught at the intensity in his eyes. "I thought I knew. I thought I had it all mapped out." Quinn squeezed his hand gently, encouraging him to continue. The last rays of sunlight caught in his hair, turning it gold at the edges, and she had to resist the urge to reach up and touch it. "But then you showed up," he continued, "with your clipboard and your marketing plans, and your complete inability to back down from an argument." A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, and Quinn felt herself smiling back despite the tension of the moment. The wind picked up, carrying the salt spray and the distant sound of seagulls. Drew took a deep breath, and Quinn could feel him gathering his courage. She waited, heart pounding, for whatever came next. Chapter 10: Victory Formation. Quinn felt the cool sand shift beneath her feet as Drew led her along the shoreline. The stadium lights had faded behind them, replaced by the amber glow of sunset stretching across the water. She could still hear distant cheers from the victory celebration, but they seemed to belong to another world entirely. Drew's hand remained warm in hers, his thumb occasionally brushing against her skin in a way that made her pulse quicken. They walked in comfortable silence, letting the rhythm of the waves fill the space between them. The familiar scent of salt air mixed with the lingering hint of his aftershave, and Quinn found herself wanting to memorize every detail of this moment. Finally, Drew slowed his pace and turned to face her. The setting sun caught the green of his eyes, making them appear almost golden. "I've been going crazy, trying to figure out what to do about this coaching offer," he admitted, running his free hand through his hair. "It's everything I thought I wanted after my injury. A chance to prove myself at a higher level." Quinn nodded, understanding all too well the pull of old dreams. "I know what you mean. The promotion in the city." She trailed off, watching a seagull dive into the waves. "It's what I was working toward for years." "But?" Drew prompted softly, taking a step closer. "But it doesn't feel right anymore." The words came out in a rush, as if she'd been holding them back. "When I first came back here, I thought it was temporary. Just a pit stop while I figured out my next move." She laughed quietly. "I never expected to fall in love with this place again." Drew's eyes softened. "With this place?" he asked, his voice carrying a hint of something more. Quinn felt heat rise to her cheeks. "The town, the team." She met his gaze. "The people." "I know what you mean," Drew said, looking out at the horizon. "When I first started coaching the Sharks, I saw it as a stepping stone. Something to do while I planned my next move." He shook his head. "But these guys, they're not just players anymore. They're family." The wind picked up, carrying the salt spray, and Quinn shivered slightly. Without hesitation, Drew pulled her closer, sheltering her from the breeze. The casual intimacy of the gesture made her heart skip. "You know what really changed things?" Drew asked, his voice low and close to her ear. "You showed up with your marketing plans and your determination to save this team. At first, I thought you were just another city person who didn't understand what we were about." Quinn laughed. "You made that pretty clear." "Yeah, well." He smiled sheepishly. "You proved me wrong. You showed me that success isn't just about what happens on the field. It's about community, about building something that matters." His expression grew serious. "You made me see the Sharks differently. Made me see everything differently." Quinn's breath caught in her throat. They were standing so close now that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "Drew?" "The coaching offer." He shook his head. "It's a great opportunity. But when I think about leaving all this behind, leaving the team, the town." His eyes locked with hers. "Leaving you, it feels wrong." The waves crashed against the shore, filling the pause between his words. Quinn found herself gripping his hand tighter. "I got the official offer from the city yesterday," she admitted. "The salary is incredible. The position would be everything I worked for in my career." "But?" Drew echoed her earlier question, his free hand coming up to brush a strand of hair from her face. "But I keep thinking about what I'd be giving up." She leaned slightly into his touch. "The shelter events we could organize, the youth program Ethan wants to expand, all the plans we've barely started." She took a deep breath. "And then there's us." Drew's hand stilled against her cheek. "Us?" "Whatever this is between us." Quinn gestured vaguely with her free hand. "I'm not ready to walk away from it." "From you." The last rays of sunlight painted the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, reflecting off the water like scattered diamonds. Drew took a small step back, just enough to look at her properly, though he kept hold of her hand. You know, when my career ended, I thought that was it, my one shot at something great gone. His voice was thoughtful. But being here, coaching these guys, working with you, I'm starting to think maybe great things don't always look the way we expect them to. Quinn felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. So what are you saying? I'm saying I'm staying. The words came out firm, certain. The Sharks need me. And more importantly, I need them. His eyes searched her face. What about you? Quinn looked out at the ocean, at the town she'd once been so eager to leave, at the man who'd somehow become essential to her happiness. I think, she said slowly, that sometimes the best opportunities aren't the ones that look the most impressive on paper. The smile that spread across Drew's face made her heart flutter. He pulled her closer, his free hand settling on her waist. The waves continued their steady rhythm behind them, but Quinn barely noticed, too caught up in the way Drew was looking at her. So you're staying too? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I'm staying, she confirmed, and the words felt right, felt like coming home. The ocean breeze picked up, sending a shiver through Quinn that had nothing to do with the temperature. Drew's hand tightened around hers, and he turned to face her fully, his expression more open than she'd ever seen it. Listen, he said, his voice rough with emotion. I know we started off butting heads, and maybe that's because we're both too stubborn for our own good. He let out a small laugh, running his free hand through his hair. But these past few months working with you, arguing with you, watching you fight for this team, it's changed everything. Quinn's heart hammered against her ribs as Drew took a step closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his green eyes. I don't want you to go back to the city, he continued, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. And it's not just about the team or the town. It's about us. This thing between us, it's real, Quinn. I think we both know it's more than just attraction or convenient timing. The waves crashed behind them, a steady rhythm that matched her pulse. Quinn found herself holding her breath as Drew's other hand came up to cup her cheek. I see a future here, he said softly. With the Sharks, with this community, but most importantly, with you. If you're willing to take that chance with me. Quinn felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, but she was smiling, really smiling, for the first time in what felt like forever. You know, she said, leaning slightly into his touch, for someone who gives such great pep talks, you seemed pretty nervous about that one. Drew laughed, the tension in his shoulders easing. Well, I've never had quite so much riding on the outcome before. I feel it too, Quinn admitted, bringing her free hand up to rest against his chest. She could feel his heart beating fast beneath her palm. When I came back here, I thought I was just taking a break, regrouping before heading back to my real life. But this became my real life when I wasn't looking. The team, the town. She met his gaze steadily. You? The smile that spread across Drew's face made her knees weak. He leaned in closer, his forehead nearly touching hers. So, is that a yes? You'll stay? That's a yes, Quinn whispered, and then his lips were on hers. The kiss was everything their previous tension had promised, passionate and deep, with years of buried feelings finally breaking the surface. Drew's hand slid from her cheek to tangle in her hair, while Quinn's fingers gripped his shirt, pulling him closer. The sound and the soft sound of their breathing. When they finally pulled apart, they were both slightly breathless. Drew rested his forehead against hers, a grin playing at the corners of his mouth. You know, Quinn said, trying to steady her voice, if someone had told me 3 months ago that I'd be kissing Drew Carson on the beach, I would have thought they were crazy. Drew chuckled, the sound rumbling through his chest. If someone had told me I'd be falling for the stubborn city girl who came to shake up my team, I would have said the same thing. Falling for, huh? Quinn teased, though her heart skipped at his words. Yeah, he said simply, pressing a quick kiss to her temple. Pretty hard, actually. They started walking again, hands intertwined, letting the gentle sound of the waves fill the comfortable silence between them. So, Quinn said after a moment, you're really going to turn down that coaching offer? Drew nodded, his expression thoughtful. You know, when I first got injured and had to leave pro ball, I thought my dreams were over. This offer felt like a second chance at that life. He squeezed her hand. But I've realized something, sometimes your dreams change. The sharks need me, and honestly, I need them too. We've built something special here, and I want to see where it goes. We certainly have, Quinn agreed, thinking of all the plans still forming in her mind. The youth program Ethan wants to expand, the community events we could organize, there's so much potential here. Speaking of potential, Drew said, a mischievous glint in his eye, how exactly are we going to handle being on the same team in more ways than one? Because I have to warn you, I'm still going to argue with you about your crazy ideas. Quinn laughed, bumping her shoulder against his. Oh, I'm counting on it, Carson. Someone needs to keep you on your toes. She paused, pretending to consider something. Although I suppose now I have other ways to win arguments. Is that right? Drew pulled her closer, his arm sliding around her waist. Quinn tilted her face up to his. Want me to demonstrate? Instead of answering, Drew dipped his head and captured her lips in another kiss, this one slower and sweeter than the first. Quinn melted into him, thinking that maybe some arguments were worth losing. They walked further down the beach, trading stories and stolen kisses as the sun began its final descent toward the horizon. Quinn found herself talking about her plans for the team's marketing strategy, and Drew listened intently, occasionally jumping in with suggestions that actually made sense. You know what's funny? Quinn said, watching the sky paint itself in brilliant oranges and pinks. When I left the city, I felt like I was giving up on success. Like coming back here meant I was failing somehow. She shook her head. I had it completely backward. Drew pulled her closer against his side. Success looks different for everyone. Sometimes it takes a while to figure out what it really means for you. Look who's getting philosophical, Quinn teased, but she nestled further into his embrace. The sun was barely a sliver above the water now, casting long shadows across the sand. Quinn rested her head against Drew's shoulder, breathing in the mix of salt air and his familiar scent. She felt more than heard his contented sigh, his chest rising and falling steadily beneath her cheek. The tide was coming in, washing away their footprints in the sand, but Quinn wasn't worried about losing her way. For the first time in a long time, she knew exactly where she was meant to be. Thank you for listening. Please subscribe, like, and comment. I love hearing from you. You can also visit me at winvalentine.com to stay up to date.